In the heart of Alaska, where the northern lights dance across endless skies and small towns huddle against the brutal cold, there exists a silence that speaks. It's not the peaceful quiet of snowfall or the gentle hush of wind through pine trees. No. This is something else entirely. A silence that carries whispers from the past, echoes of events that official reports couldn't explain, stories that residents speak of only in hushed tones, behind closed doors, when the long winter nights grow too heavy to bear alone. Alaska's beauty is undeniable. Its vastness, breathtaking. But beneath that pristine wilderness, beneath the charm of small communities where everyone knows everyone, lies something darker. Something that feeds on isolation, that thrives in the spaces between civilization and the unknown. Tonight, we journey into 11 towns scattered across this frozen frontier. 11 places where ordinary people encountered the extraordinary. Where fishermen vanished from running boats, where children with black eyes knocked on doors in the dead of night, where entire families disappeared leaving only warm meals on kitchen tables. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are not campfire tales designed to frighten children. These are documented accounts, police reports, witness testimonies from people who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by speaking out. People who saw things that challenged everything they believed about the world, about safety, about the thin line between reality and nightmare. Each story we'll explore tonight carries with it the weight of truth, the chill of authentic terror that can only come from real events, real people, real fear. From the fishing ports of Cordova to the abandoned ruins of drowned towns, from the endless tundra around Bethel to the towering isolation of Whittier, we'll walk in the footsteps of those who witnessed the impossible. The cold in Alaska doesn't just bite your skin. It seeps into your bones, into your soul, and sometimes it brings things with it. Things that shouldn't exist. Things that leave evidence behind, claw marks on boat railings, symbols carved into trees, footprints in the snow that lead nowhere and come from nothing. So pull your blankets closer. Lock your doors. Because once you hear these stories, once you understand what lurks in Alaska's small towns, you'll never look at isolation the same way again. You'll never trust the silence. And you'll never stop wondering if somewhere, in the frozen darkness, something is watching you too. Welcome to the true stories that Alaska tried to bury. Welcome to the whispers in the frozen silence. Story 1, The Vanishing Fisherman of Cordova. The harbor at Cordova smells of salt, diesel fuel, and dreams deferred. In 1997, it was the kind of place where men made their living pulling salmon from the unforgiving waters of Prince William Sound, where the line between survival and disaster was as thin as morning ice on the docks. Marcus Henley had been fishing these waters for 15 years. At 42, he was neither the oldest nor the youngest captain in the fleet, but he had something many others lacked, an almost supernatural ability to read the sea. Other fishermen would watch him leave port on days when the weather looked questionable, only to return hours later with holds full of silver salmon while they sat empty-handed at the dock. His boat, the Sarah's Dream, named after his daughter back in Oregon, was a 30-foot seiner that he maintained with the kind of obsessive care that kept men alive in waters that had claimed countless others. Every bolt was checked, every line inspected, every piece of equipment tested and retested until Marcus was satisfied it would hold against whatever the sound might throw at him. On September 23, 1997, Marcus left Cordova Harbor at 5:30 in the morning. The weather report called for moderate seas, light winds, and clear skies. It was the kind of day that veteran fishermen called a gift from the sea gods. Harbor Master Bill Kowalski watched the Sarah's Dream chug past the breakwater, her engine purring with mechanical contentment, her captain visible in the wheelhouse with his trademark coffee mug in hand. It was the last time anyone would see Marcus Henley alive. The first sign something was wrong came at 2 in the afternoon. The Sarah's Dream was due to check in with the Coast Guard at noon, a routine safety protocol that Marcus never missed. When the call didn't come, the Coast Guard initially wasn't concerned. Radio problems were common, and Marcus was known for working his nets until the last possible moment of good light. But when 3 o'clock passed without contact, and then 4, concern began to creep into the voices of the radio operators. At 4:30, they dispatched a search helicopter to Marcus's usual fishing grounds, a protected inlet about 12 miles northeast of Cordova where the salmon runs were particularly strong that time of year. They found the Sarah's Dream at 5:15, drifting in a lazy circle about 3 miles from where Marcus typically set his nets. The helicopter pilot, a 20-year veteran named Tom Richards, would later describe the scene in his official report with words that barely contained his bewilderment. The boat's engine was still running. The wheelhouse lights were on. The radio was functioning perfectly. And there was no sign of Marcus Henley anywhere. When the Coast Guard cutter reached the Sarah's Dream an hour later, the investigation team found something that would haunt them for years. The boat's deck showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Deep gouges scarred the fiberglass, as if something with claws had raked across the surface with tremendous force. The port railing, where Marcus typically hauled in his nets, was bent outward at an impossible angle, the metal twisted as if something massive had struck it from below. But it was the marks on the wheelhouse that truly defied explanation. 4 parallel scratches, each about 8 inches long, were carved into the reinforced glass of the front window. The glass hadn't shattered, but the scratches went deep, deeper than any normal tool should have been able to achieve. Coast Guard investigator Sarah Chen would later state that the marks appeared to have been made by claws, but claws that would have belonged to an animal far larger than anything known to inhabit Prince William Sound. Inside the wheelhouse, Marcus's coffee mug sat half full on the instrument panel. His jacket hung on its usual hook. His wallet, containing $300 in cash, remained untouched in the drawer beneath the radio. Everything suggested that Marcus had simply vanished mid-morning, leaving behind a boat that continued to run without him for hours. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators examined the boat's fish hold. Marcus had been having an exceptionally good day. The hold contained nearly 800 pounds of premium salmon, all fresh, all properly iced. But scattered among the fish were fragments of something else. Pieces of what appeared to be scales, but scales unlike anything the marine biologists had ever seen. They were translucent, about the size of dinner plates, and they seemed to shimmer with their own internal light even after being removed from the water. Dr. Michael Torres, a marine biologist from the University of Alaska, examined the scales at the Coast Guard's request. His findings, buried in a file that wouldn't see daylight for another decade, concluded that the scales belonged to no known species of fish. The cellular structure was unlike anything in the scientific literature, and the scales themselves appeared to be composed of a protein chain that didn't exist in any catalogued marine life. The official investigation lasted 3 weeks. Search teams scoured thousands of square miles of ocean, checked every island, every inlet, every possible location where Marcus might have made landfall. They found nothing. No body, no life raft, no debris from the boat that might indicate how he'd left it. The Sarah's Dream showed no signs of collision, no evidence of mechanical failure, nothing that would explain why an experienced fisherman would abandon a perfectly functioning vessel in calm seas. The Coast Guard's final report listed Marcus Henley as lost at sea, cause unknown. They theorized that he might have fallen overboard while hauling nets, despite the fact that Marcus always wore a safety harness and the harness was found still hanging in the wheelhouse, unused. They suggested equipment failure, though every piece of gear on the boat was in perfect working order. They even proposed that Marcus might have staged his own disappearance, though he had no debts, no enemies, and a daughter he called every night without fail. What the official report didn't mention were the statements from other fishermen who were working the Sound that day. 3 separate boats reported seeing something large moving beneath the surface near Marcus's usual fishing grounds. Captain Jim Morrison of the vessel Northern Star described it as a shadow the size of a school bus, moving too fast and too purposefully to be a whale. The crew of the fishing vessel Aleutian Dawn reported their depth finder picking up a massive object that seemed to be tracking their boat for nearly 20 minutes before disappearing into deeper water. Most unsettling was the account from Bobby Chen, no relation to the Coast Guard investigator, who was fishing about 2 miles from where the Sarah's Dream was found. At approximately 11:30 that morning, Bobby heard what he described as a sound unlike anything in his 30 years on the water. It was a low, resonant call that seemed to come from beneath his boat, a sound he compared to whale song but deeper, more complex, almost like language. Bobby's account was dismissed by investigators, filed away with dozens of other witness reports that didn't fit the neat narrative of an accidental drowning. But Bobby never forgot that sound, and in the years that followed, he would sometimes hear it again in his dreams, always followed by the image of something massive rising from the depths, something with claws that could tear through steel and eyes that held an intelligence that was decidedly not human. The Sarah's dream was eventually sold at auction, purchased by another fisherman who rechristened her the Second Chance. But the new owner lasted only 2 seasons before selling her again, claiming that the boat was unlucky, that strange things happened when he took her to certain parts of the Sound. The next owner kept her for less than a year before abandoning her at the dock, walking away from a $40,000 investment without explanation. She sits there still, tied to Pier 7 in Cordova Harbor, her hull slowly collecting barnacles and rust. The harbor master has tried repeatedly to find someone willing to take her, even offering her for free to anyone willing to pay the back moorage fees. But fishermen are a superstitious lot, and word has spread about the boat where Marcus Henley vanished, the boat with claw marks in her wheelhouse glass and gouges in her deck that no one can explain. Sometimes, on foggy mornings when the Sound is particularly still, harbor workers report hearing the Sarah's Dream's engine start up on its own, idling for a few minutes before falling silent again. The current harbor master, Bill Kowalski's replacement, has checked the boat multiple times and found no electrical problems, no reason for the engine to spontaneously ignite. But the reports continue, and they've become part of the local folklore, another mystery in a town that's seen more than its share. Marcus Henley's daughter Sarah, now a grown woman with children of her own, still receives a Christmas card every year from Cordova, postmarked but with no return address. The card always contains the same message, written in her father's distinctive handwriting: "Still fishing. Love, Dad." She's had the handwriting analyzed, consulted with experts, even hired a private investigator to trace the card's origin. Nothing. The cards appear exactly as they did 25 years ago, the handwriting never aging, never changing, as if time itself has stopped. Somewhere in the depths of Prince William Sound, the truth about what happened to Marcus Henley remains hidden beneath the dark waters of Alaska, in the places where the light never reaches and things that should not exist still hunt in the endless cold. But sometimes, on particularly clear nights, fishermen working the Sound report seeing lights moving beneath their boats, lights that pulse in patterns too regular to be natural, too complex to be random. And in those moments, they remember Marcus Henley and wonder if, somewhere in the depths, he's still out there, still fishing, still trying to find his way home. Story 2, Lights Over Nome. Nome, Alaska sits on the edge of the world like a forgotten prayer, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the shore of the Bering Sea where civilization makes its last desperate stand against the infinite Arctic. In this town of 3,600 souls, where the sun disappears for months at a time and the aurora borealis paints the sky in colors that have no earthly names, strange things are expected. But what happened in the winter of 2005 challenged even Nome's generous definition of strange. The lights first appeared on February 14, Valentine's Day, which the few romantic souls in Nome thought was either deeply ironic or profoundly appropriate, depending on your view of cosmic humor. Jenny Morrison, a nurse at the Norton Sound Regional Hospital, was working the night shift when she noticed them through the break room window. At first, she assumed they were helicopter lights, perhaps a medical evacuation from one of the remote villages that dotted the surrounding tundra. But helicopters don't hover motionless for 3 hours. They don't pulse with an internal luminescence that shifts from white to blue to something that exists just beyond the visible spectrum. And they certainly don't make absolutely no sound while floating 200 feet above the center of town, bathing the snow-covered streets in an otherworldly glow that made shadows dance like living things. Jenny called her supervisor, head nurse Patricia Yazzie, who took one look out the window and immediately contacted the police. Officer David Kuntz was the first responder, and his radio transmission to dispatch at 11:47 p.m. would become part of Nome's unofficial record of the impossible. "Dispatch, I'm looking at some kind of aircraft over Front Street. No sound, no identification, just hovering there like it owns the place. Requesting backup and maybe someone who knows about military operations in the area." Within an hour, half the town was awake and standing in their yards, necks craned toward the sky, watching lights that defied every law of physics they understood. The objects, and there were definitely multiple objects, moved with a fluid grace that seemed to mock the clumsy mechanics of human flight. They would hover motionless for minutes at a time, then suddenly shift position faster than the eye could follow, reappearing instantly in formations that suggested intelligence, purpose, and a technology that existed somewhere far beyond the reach of human understanding. Tom Begic, a bush pilot with 25 years of experience flying in Alaska's most challenging conditions, watched from his front porch with a pair of binoculars and a growing sense of unease. He'd seen everything the Arctic sky could throw at him: military jets, weather balloons, unusual atmospheric phenomena that could make experienced pilots question their sanity. But this was different. These lights moved with intention, responding to each other in what appeared to be complex communication patterns, pulsing and shifting in sequences too intricate to be natural, too purposeful to be random. The show continued until 3:17 a.m., when the lights simply vanished. Not gradually, not fading into the distance, but gone between one blink and the next, leaving behind only the familiar darkness of an Arctic winter night and the unsettling feeling that something fundamental had changed in the world. The next morning brought a different kind of strangeness. Martha Kokik, a respected elder and traditional healer, was missing from her home on Fifth Avenue. Her house was locked from the inside, all doors and windows secured, but Martha was nowhere to be found. Her bed hadn't been slept in, but her nightgown was laid out neatly on the covers as if she'd intended to put it on. Her evening medication sat untouched on the kitchen counter next to a cup of tea that was still warm when police arrived. The investigation that followed would become one of the most frustrating cases in known police department history. Martha's house showed no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no indication that anyone had been inside other than Martha herself. The locks were all engaged from the interior, the security chain was in place, and the windows were latched shut with their winter seals intact. It was as if Martha had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the mystery of how a 73-year-old woman had vanished from a locked house without disturbing so much as a teacup. The search for Martha involved the entire community. Volunteers scoured every building in Nome, checked every outbuilding, every storage shed, every possible place where an elderly woman might have taken shelter. Search and rescue teams expanded their efforts to the surrounding tundra, using dogs, helicopters, and ground teams to cover hundreds of square miles of frozen wilderness. They found nothing. Martha's family, particularly her grandson James, refused to accept the official theory that she'd somehow left the house and gotten lost in the Arctic night. James pointed out that his grandmother was lucid, healthy for her age, and intimately familiar with Nome's layout after living there for 60 years. She wasn't the type of woman to wander off in the middle of winter, and even if she had, the locked house remained an impossible puzzle. But James had another theory, one that he shared reluctantly with the police and more openly with family members who understood the traditional beliefs that still held sway in many Alaska Native communities. 3 days before the lights appeared, Martha had begun speaking about dreams that visited her each night. Dreams of voices calling to her from the sky, voices that spoke in the old language but with words she didn't recognize, promising to show her things that existed beyond the edge of the world. In Inupiaq tradition, dreams of this nature were not dismissed as mere neuron firings of a sleeping brain. They were considered communications from the spirit world, messages that carried weight and consequence in the waking world. Martha had told James that the voices in her dreams were not human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They felt ancient, she said, like something that had been waiting for a very long time to make contact. The morning after Martha's disappearance, several other Nome residents reported strange dreams from the night before. Sarah Chen, a schoolteacher who lived 6 blocks from Martha's house, dreamed of walking through her neighborhood while bathed in blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. In her dream, she encountered Martha standing in the middle of Front Street, looking up at the sky with an expression of profound peace. When Sarah approached Martha in the dream, the older woman turned to her and said, "They've been waiting so long for someone who could hear them properly. I have to go with them now, but I want you to know I'm not afraid. They're taking me to see things that will help our people understand what's coming." The dream felt so real that Sarah woke up expecting to find herself standing in the street, but she was safely in her own bed, with no memory of having left it. Still, the dream was so vivid, so detailed, that she reported it to the police, adding another piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. Dr. Michael Torres, the same marine biologist who had examined the mysterious scales found on Marcus Henley's boat 8 years earlier, happened to be in Nome conducting research on climate change's impact on Bering Sea marine life. When he heard about the lights and the disappearance, he requested permission to interview witnesses and examine any physical evidence that might have been left behind. What Torres discovered added another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable situation. Using specialized equipment, he detected unusual electromagnetic readings in the area where the lights had been most concentrated. The readings suggested the presence of energy fields that were far beyond anything produced by known technology, fields that had somehow altered the molecular structure of the snow and ice in a 3-block radius around Martha's house. Most intriguingly, Torres found traces of the same unusual protein chains that had appeared in the scales from the Cordova incident. The proteins were embedded in the snow itself, as if they had been dispersed from a great height and settled like microscopic rain over the entire area. When subjected to spectrographic analysis, the proteins showed characteristics that didn't match any known biological compounds, suggesting they originated from life forms that operated according to different biochemical principles than anything found on Earth. Torres's findings were included in a report that was immediately classified by federal authorities and removed from public access. Official explanations for the lights ranged from atmospheric disturbance to military training exercise, though no military branch claimed responsibility for any operations in the Nome area during the relevant time period. Martha Kokik was never found. Her case remains open, though active investigation ceased after 6 months when all leads were exhausted. Her house was eventually sold to a family from Anchorage who lasted exactly 2 weeks before moving back to the city, claiming that the house felt occupied despite being obviously empty. The new owners were replaced by a series of short-term renters, none of whom stayed longer than a month. They all reported the same phenomena: the sound of footsteps in the attic, the smell of traditional Alaska native foods cooking in the kitchen when no one was there, and most disturbing, the sight of an elderly Inupiaq woman standing at the living room window, looking up at the sky with an expression of infinite patience. The house has been empty for 3 years now, but neighbors report that lights still appear in the windows on clear winter nights, soft glows that pulse in patterns reminiscent of the original lights that appeared over Nome. Some believe it's Martha, still trying to communicate something important to the living world. Others think it's evidence that whatever took her is still present, still watching, still waiting for the right conditions to make contact again. James Kokik maintains a vigil of sorts, visiting his grandmother's house every week to check on its condition and leave traditional offerings on the front porch. He's convinced that Martha isn't dead but has been taken somewhere that exists outside normal space and time, somewhere she went willingly because she understood something about the visitors that the rest of Nome couldn't grasp. On February 14 each year, the anniversary of the light's first appearance, James stands in front of his grandmother's house and watches the sky. He's never seen the lights return, but he's never stopped hoping they will. Because somewhere in the vast darkness above the Arctic, he believes Martha is still alive, still learning, still serving as a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to intersect but somehow found a way to touch, however briefly, in the endless winter night over Nome. Story 3, The Black-Eyed Stranger in Talkeetna. Talkeetna exists as a monument to Alaska's frontier spirit, a town of 800 residents where the old ways die hard and strangers are noticed immediately. Nestled at the confluence of 3 rivers, with Denali looming in the distance like a sleeping giant, it's the kind of place where neighbors know each other's schedules, where unusual events become the subject of coffee shop conversations for months, and where the difference between local and outsider is measured not in years but in generations. The winter of 2003 was particularly brutal, even by Alaska standards. Temperatures dropped to 40 below and stayed there for weeks, turning the air itself into something sharp and dangerous that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. It was the kind of cold that made sensible people lock their doors early and keep them locked until spring, the kind of weather that turned human beings into careful hermits who ventured outside only when absolutely necessary. Which is why the knocking was so strange. It began on a Tuesday night in January, at the home of Robert and Linda Fitzgerald on C Street. They'd lived in Talkeetna for 30 years, raised 3 children there, and knew every face in town. So when someone started knocking on their door at 11:30 at night, in temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in less than an hour, they knew something was seriously wrong. Robert opened the door expecting to find a neighbor in distress, perhaps someone whose car had broken down or whose heating system had failed. Instead, he found himself staring at a man he'd never seen before, someone who appeared to be in his mid-30s, of average height and build, wearing clothes that seemed inadequate for the deadly cold, a thin jacket, no gloves, no hat, shoes that looked more suitable for a summer walk than an Arctic night. But it was the man's eyes that made Robert step back involuntarily. They were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible eye, as if someone had filled his sockets with crude oil. No white sclera, no colored iris, just an endless darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "I need to come inside," the man said, his voice carrying a strange quality that Robert would later describe as being simultaneously very young and impossibly old. "I'm cold, and I need to warm up. May I come in?" Robert's first instinct was to help. 30 years in Alaska had ingrained in him the unwritten law of the frontier: you don't leave people out in killing weather, regardless of who they are or where they came from. But something about the stranger's presence triggered every survival instinct Robert had developed in 3 decades of northern living. This wasn't right. Nothing about this situation was right. "Where did you come from?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady while his hand remained firmly on the door frame, blocking entry. "There's no car in the street, and the nearest town is 50 miles away." The stranger tilted his head slightly, like a curious bird studying an interesting insect. "I walked," he said simply. "I've been walking for a long time. May I please come inside? I just need to get warm." Linda had joined Robert at the door by this point, and she would later tell police that looking at the stranger was like looking into deep water at night. His face was pleasant enough, unremarkable in most ways, but his eyes held a depth that seemed to go on forever, and staring into them made her feel dizzy, as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff and fighting the urge to step off. "I'm sorry," Robert said, beginning to close the door, "but we can't let strangers into our house at night. If you need help, I can call the police or an ambulance." The stranger's expression didn't change, but something in the air around him seemed to shift. The temperature, already well below zero, seemed to drop even further. The moisture in Robert's breath began freezing before it could dissipate, creating tiny ice crystals that fell like snow. "Please," the stranger said again, and this time his voice carried harmonics that didn't belong in human speech, undertones that seemed to resonate in Robert's chest cavity. "I just need to come inside. I need to get warm. You have to let me in." Robert slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, his hands shaking from more than just the cold. Through the window, he and Linda watched the stranger stand motionless on their porch for nearly 20 minutes, never moving, never seeming to react to the deadly temperature, just staring at the door with those impossible black eyes. When he finally left, he didn't walk down the driveway like a normal person. He simply turned and walked directly into the woods behind their house, his figure disappearing into the trees without any apparent concern for the deep snow, the hidden obstacles, or the fact that those woods stretched for hundreds of miles of uninhabited wilderness. The Fitzgeralds didn't sleep that night. They sat up with every light in the house on, checking the locks repeatedly, jumping at every sound the wind made as it rattled their windows. When morning came, they ventured outside to examine their porch for evidence of their midnight visitor. The concrete steps leading to their front door were cracked. Not from age or weather, but with fresh breaks that radiated outward from 2 specific spots where the stranger's feet would have been standing. The cracks followed an unusual pattern, as if tremendous pressure had been applied from above, far more pressure than any human being should have been able to generate. More disturbing were the footprints leading away from the house. They were clearly visible in the snow, pressed deep and crisp, but they ended abruptly at the tree line. Not faded or filled in by wind, but simply stopped, as if the person making them had been lifted into the air mid-step. Robert reported the incident to the Talkeetna Police Department, more out of civic duty than any expectation that something would be done. Chief of Police Harold Zimmerman had heard stranger stories over the years and filed the report with the kind of polite skepticism that small-town police officers develop as a survival mechanism. But 2 nights later, the stranger knocked on another door. The Patterson family lived on 2nd Street, about 6 blocks from the Fitzgeralds. Jerry Patterson was a hunting guide who'd spent his entire 45 years in Alaska and prided himself on his ability to read people and situations. When the knocking started at his door around midnight, he grabbed his rifle before going to investigate. The man standing on his porch matched Robert Fitzgerald's description exactly: average build, inadequate clothing, and eyes like black holes that seemed to pull light into themselves. But there was something additional that Robert hadn't mentioned, something that made Jerry's skin crawl even before the stranger spoke. The man cast no shadow. Despite the bright porch light shining directly on him, despite the snow-covered ground that should have shown the outline of his form, there was no shadow. He stood there like a figure cut from black paper and pasted onto the night, existing in defiance of basic physics. "I need to come inside," the stranger said, his voice carrying that same strange quality of youth and ancient age. "I'm very cold. Will you let me in?" Jerry kept his rifle trained on the stranger while he responded. "Hell no, I won't let you in. Get off my property before I call the police." The stranger showed no reaction to the weapon pointed at him. "I just need to get warm," he repeated. "I've been walking for such a long time. Please. You have to let me in." Jerry would later tell investigators that the stranger's plea wasn't just spoken but somehow felt, as if the words were being transmitted directly into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. It was a sensation he described as deeply invasive, like having someone else's thoughts forced into his skull. "I said get lost," Jerry repeated, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm armed, and I'll use this if you don't leave right now." The stranger tilted his head again, that same bird-like gesture that Robert had described. "You can't hurt me with that," he said matter-of-factly. "But I'm not here to hurt you either. I just need warmth. I need to come inside where it's warm." Jerry fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing across the frozen town like thunder. When the echo faded, the stranger was gone. Not walking away, not running, just gone, as if he'd never been there at all. The police investigation that followed was more thorough this time, partly because Jerry Patterson was a respected member of the community and partly because Chief Zimmerman was beginning to see a pattern that troubled him. 2 families, 6 blocks apart, reporting nearly identical encounters with a stranger who shouldn't have been able to survive in the conditions he was walking around in. But it was the 3rd incident that transformed the situation from curious to terrifying. The Morrison family lived on the outskirts of town, in a house that sat on 5 acres of wooded land. Mark Morrison worked as a mechanic, his wife Susan taught at the local elementary school, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Jake and 6-year-old Emma, were typical small-town kids who helped with chores and played in the endless daylight of summer and the endless darkness of winter. On the night of January 22nd, the stranger came to their door. Mark wasn't home. He was working late at the garage, trying to get a tourist's car running so they could continue their journey south. Susan was alone with the children, watching a movie on their old television while the wind howled outside and the temperature dropped to levels that made exposed skin freeze in seconds. The knocking was soft at first, almost polite. Susan assumed it was Mark, perhaps having forgotten his keys in his hurry to get to work. She opened the door without looking through the peephole, and found herself face to face with the black-eyed stranger. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him were Jake and Emma. Susan's children stood perfectly still on the porch, their own eyes now as black as their companions', their faces expressionless, their breath creating no visible vapor in the deadly cold. They were dressed exactly as they had been when Susan tucked them into bed an hour earlier, pajamas, bare feet, no coats or protection against weather that could kill them in minutes. "Your children invited me in," the stranger said, his voice carrying new harmonics that made Susan's teeth ache. They understand that I need warmth. They want to help me get warm. Jake, her sweet 8-year-old son who still asked for bedtime stories, turned his black eyes toward his mother and spoke in a voice that sounded like his own but carried undertones that belonged to something much older and infinitely patient. "Mom, he's really cold. We should let him in. We should all go inside together and get warm." Emma nodded, her 6-year-old face wearing an expression of adult seriousness that no child should possess. "He's been waiting outside for so long, Mom. He just wants to be warm like us." Susan would later tell investigators that she knew with absolute certainty that the children standing on her porch were not her children, despite looking exactly like them, despite sounding like them, despite wearing their clothes and standing in their characteristic poses. Something fundamental had been changed, replaced, or removed from them, leaving behind perfect physical copies animated by something that was decidedly not human. She slammed the door and ran to the children's bedrooms, her heart hammering as she prepared to find empty beds, evidence that something had taken her babies and left imposters in their place. Instead, she found Jake and Emma exactly where she'd left them, sleeping peacefully in their beds, breathing normally, completely unaware that perfect copies of themselves had just been standing on the front porch. The knocking continued for 3 hours. Sometimes it was the stranger, sometimes it was the false versions of her children, sometimes it was voices she didn't recognize calling her name and asking to be let inside. Susan sat in the hallway outside her children's rooms with Mark's shotgun across her lap, checking on Jake and Emma every few minutes to make sure they were still there, still real, still her own children. When Mark came home at 2 in the morning, he found the porch empty and his wife in a state of near catatonic terror. The footprints in the snow told a story that defied rational explanation, adult-sized prints leading to the door, child-sized prints that seemed to have materialized beside them, and then all 3 sets leading away into the woods, where they vanished as completely as if their makers had been lifted into the sky. The next morning, the Morrison family packed their belongings and left Talkeetna permanently. They never returned, not even to collect the belongings they left behind or to sell the house that still sits empty on the edge of town. In the weeks that followed, other families reported similar encounters. Always the same stranger with the impossible black eyes, always the same request to come inside and get warm, always the same wrongness that made decent people slam doors on someone who appeared to be in desperate need of help. But it was the Wilson family that made the ultimate mistake. They let him in. On February 8, 2003, neighbors noticed that the Wilson house was dark despite the family's routine of keeping lights on during the long Arctic nights. When police performed a welfare check 2 days later, they found the house unlocked, the heat still running, and 3 place settings on the kitchen table with food that had been partially eaten and then abandoned. Harold Wilson, his wife Margaret, and their 16-year-old daughter Sarah were gone. Their car was still in the driveway, their belongings undisturbed, their beds unslept in. The only clue to their fate was a message written on the bathroom mirror in what appeared to be condensation from someone's breath, "Finally warm." The Wilson family was never found. Their disappearance was officially classified as a missing persons case, though no evidence was ever discovered to suggest where they might have gone or why they would have left voluntarily. The black-eyed stranger was never seen again in Talkeetna. But sometimes, on the coldest nights of winter, residents report hearing soft knocking at their doors, followed by voices that sound like family members asking to be let inside. The smart ones don't answer. The smart ones have learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The Wilson house stands empty now, its windows dark, its rooms gradually filling with the dust of abandonment. But neighbors swear that on certain nights, when the temperature drops below 30 and the aurora borealis paints the sky in unnatural colors, lights can be seen moving through the house, and the sound of a family having dinner drifts across the frozen air, as if somewhere inside that empty structure, the Wilsons are still sitting around their kitchen table, finally warm, finally at peace, finally home. Story 4, The Howls of Bethel. Bethel squats on the tundra like a defiant fist raised against the Arctic wilderness, a city of 6,000 souls serving as the hub of southwestern Alaska where the Kuskokwim River meets civilization's last meaningful stand. It's a place where subsistence hunting isn't a romantic notion but a necessity for survival, where the difference between predator and prey can shift with the wind, and where the sound that echoes across the endless flatland can mean the difference between life and death. In the winter of 2010, something new began to howl in the darkness beyond Bethel's scattered lights. The first reports came from the Yupik elders, men and women who had spent their entire lives reading the subtle language of the tundra, who could identify every creature that moved across the vast expanse of grass and permafrost by the sound of its passage. These were people who understood wolves, who had hunted with them and been hunted by them, who knew the difference between the call of a pack leader and the desperate cry of an injured animal. What they heard in January 2010 was neither. Elder Mary Kanguk was the first to report it officially, though her account was preceded by weeks of quiet conversations in the Yupik language, discussions held in the traditional gathering spaces where the old knowledge was still respected and the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds were understood to be far more permeable than Western science suggested. Mary lived in a small house on the outskirts of Bethel, close enough to town to have electricity and running water but far enough from the center to maintain the connection to the land that had sustained her people for thousands of years. Her house sat on a slight rise that gave her a view across miles of tundra, and she often spent her evenings looking out across the landscape, reading the subtle signs that told her what moved in the darkness beyond her vision. On the night of January 15th, she heard something that made her close her curtains and check her door locks twice. The howl started low, a rumbling bass note that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from any creature standing on its surface. It built slowly, rising through frequencies that made Mary's bones ache, climbing to a pitch that shouldn't have been possible for any animal to produce. But it was the intelligence in the sound that truly frightened her, the sense that whatever was making this noise was not simply expressing emotion or communicating with others of its kind, but was actively probing, testing, searching for something specific. Mary had lived through 83 winters in Alaska. She had heard wolves howl in triumph after a successful hunt, in mourning for fallen pack members, in challenge to rivals and in greeting to allies. She had heard the desperate cries of injured animals, the territorial warnings of creatures defending their young, and the death songs of beasts facing their final moments. This was something else entirely. This was the sound of something that was not entirely animal but not entirely something else either. It carried intelligence, yes, but an intelligence that operated according to principles that had nothing to do with the natural world Mary understood. The howl continued for nearly 10 minutes, echoing across the tundra with a persistence that suggested the creature making it was in no hurry to move on. When it finally faded, Mary realized she had been holding her breath, and that every dog within miles had fallen completely silent. Over the following weeks, other residents began reporting similar encounters. Jimmy Alexi, a hunter who ran traplines 30 miles outside of town, heard the howls while checking his snares and described them as sounding like a wolf the size of a building learning how to speak. Sarah Nick, a teacher who lived in the housing complex near the school, woke to the sound at 3 a.m. and found that the howls seemed to be coming from directly outside her bedroom window, despite the fact that her apartment was on the 3rd floor. But it was Tommy Evan, a 17-year-old who worked part-time at the airport, who provided the first visual confirmation that something unusual was stalking the edges of Bethel. Tommy was driving his snowmobile back from his girlfriend's house on the night of February 3rd, following a well-worn trail that connected the residential areas to the industrial section where the airport and fuel storage facilities were located. The trail ran through about 2 miles of open tundra, offering clear sight lines in all directions, which is why Tommy noticed the shadow moving parallel to his course about 100 yards to his left. At first, he assumed it was a caribou or possibly a moose, though both species were rare in the immediate vicinity of Bethel during winter months. But as he continued along the trail, he realized that whatever was pacing him was moving with a deliberate purpose, maintaining a consistent distance and speed that suggested it was actively tracking his progress rather than simply traveling in the same direction. Tommy stopped his snowmobile and pulled out the powerful flashlight he carried for emergencies. When he aimed the beam toward the shadow, what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The creature was massive, easily the size of a small bear but built along the lines of a wolf. Its fur was darker than the night around it, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, and its eyes glowed with a pale blue radiance that seemed to come from within rather than being reflected from Tommy's flashlight. But it was the way the creature moved that truly unnerved him. It didn't bound or lope like a normal animal but seemed to flow across the snow, its motion so fluid and effortless that it appeared to be gliding rather than running. When Tommy's light hit it, the creature stopped and turned to face him directly. For nearly 30 seconds, they stared at each other across the frozen tundra, predator and prey locked in a moment of mutual assessment. Then the creature opened its mouth and released the howl that Mary Kanguk and others had been hearing for weeks. Up close, the sound was overwhelming. Tommy would later describe it as being like standing next to a jet engine, but a jet engine that could sing, that could modulate its roar into something that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the listener's chest and skull. The howls seemed to carry messages, complex communications that Tommy's human brain couldn't decode but somehow understood on a primitive level. The creature was calling to others of its kind. It was announcing that it had found something interesting. And it was asking for help. Tommy gunned his snowmobile and raced back toward town, not slowing down until he reached the safety of streetlights and human habitation. When he looked back, he could see eyes reflecting in the darkness at the edge of the light's reach, multiple pairs of eyes that suggested the creature hadn't been alone. The official response to Tommy's report was predictably skeptical. Bethel Police Chief Robert Nick, Sarah's husband, filed the incident as a possible wolf sighting but noted in his report that wolves of the size Tommy described were not known to exist in Alaska. He contacted the State Fish and Wildlife Department, who promised to look into the matter but ultimately concluded that Tommy had most likely encountered a large dog or possibly a wolf that appeared larger than it actually was due to poor lighting conditions and understandable fear. But the howls continued, and the sightings multiplied. Over the next month, nearly 24 Bethel residents reported encounters with unusually large wolf-like creatures. The descriptions were remarkably consistent: animals that moved too smoothly, that seemed too intelligent, that watched humans with an intensity that suggested they were learning, studying, preparing for something. The situation escalated dramatically on March 12, when the creatures apparently decided that observation was no longer sufficient. The first attack occurred at the home of Peter and Anna Nuka, a couple in their 60s who lived in a small house on the eastern edge of town. They kept a team of sled dogs, 8 beautiful animals that were Peter's pride and joy, descendants of champions that had run the Iditarod and other major races. Peter was awakened around 2 in the morning by the sound of his dogs barking, but not the normal alert barking that might indicate a stranger or another animal in the vicinity. This was the sound of terror, the desperate cries of animals facing something that triggered every survival instinct they possessed. By the time Peter grabbed his rifle and made it outside, 3 of his dogs were dead and 2 others were missing entirely. The remaining animals huddled in the far corner of their pen, whimpering and refusing to approach the area where their pack mates had been killed. The scene was unlike anything Peter had encountered in 50 years of living in Alaska. The dead dogs hadn't been killed for food, very little flesh had been consumed. Instead, they appeared to have been killed for sport, or possibly as a message. Their bodies were arranged in a deliberate pattern, laid out with a precision that suggested intelligence and planning. Most disturbing were the tracks around the pen. They were clearly canine but far larger than any wolf track Peter had ever seen. The stride length suggested an animal that would have stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, well beyond the size range of any known North American wolf subspecies. But it was the way the tracks ended that truly unnerved him. They led directly to the dog pen, circled it several times, and then simply vanished. Not gradually faded or filled in by wind, but stopped abruptly, as if the creatures making them had simply ceased to exist. Similar attacks occurred over the following weeks. Dogs disappeared from yards, livestock vanished from pens, and hunters reported finding the remains of caribou and other game animals killed but not eaten, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual rather than predation. The breaking point came when 16-year-old Michael Charlie claimed to have shot one of the creatures. Michael was an experienced hunter despite his age, someone who had been tracking game across the tundra since he was old enough to carry a rifle. On March 28, he was checking snares about 5 miles outside of town when he encountered one of the creatures in broad daylight. The animal was feeding on a caribou that had been caught in one of Michael's snares, but feeding in a way that Michael had never seen before. Instead of tearing at the meat in the efficient manner of a natural predator, the creature seemed to be selecting specific organs, consuming them in a particular order, as if following some kind of ritual protocol. Michael was hidden behind a small rise about 50 yards away, close enough to get a clear shot with his .30-06 rifle. He took careful aim and fired, hitting the creature's center mass with a shot that should have dropped any animal instantly. The creature spun around from the impact but didn't fall. Instead, it stood on its hind legs, reaching a height of nearly 7 feet, and stared directly at Michael's hiding place with eyes that glowed like pale blue flames. For several seconds, they faced each other across the frozen tundra, and Michael would later swear that the creature smiled at him, revealing teeth that were too sharp and arranged in patterns that didn't belong in any natural predator's mouth. Then the creature dropped back to all fours and walked away, not running or limping but moving with the same fluid grace that other witnesses had described. It left behind a trail of dark blood in the snow, proof that Michael's shot had found its mark, but also evidence that whatever he had hit was far more resilient than any normal animal. Michael followed the blood trail for nearly 2 miles before it led to an area where the snow had been disturbed in unusual patterns. The blood stopped abruptly at the center of what appeared to be a large circle worn into the permafrost, as if many creatures had walked the same path repeatedly over a long period of time. Around the circle, Michael found patches of fur that didn't match any animal he could identify. The fur was coarse and dark, but when he held it up to the light, it seemed to shimmer with colors that shifted depending on the angle of view. When he tried to collect samples, the fur crumbled to dust in his hands, leaving behind only a faint odor that reminded him of ozone and copper. Michael's account of shooting one of the creatures marked the end of the sightings around Bethel. After March 28, the howls stopped, the attack ceased, and the strange tracks no longer appeared in the snow around town. Whatever had been stalking the edges of civilization seemed to have moved on, leaving behind only memories, unanswered questions, and a community that would never again feel entirely safe when darkness fell across the tundra. The official investigation concluded that Bethel had experienced an unusually aggressive pack of wolves, possibly suffering from disease or environmental stress that had altered their normal behavior patterns. The larger-than-normal size was attributed to perspective distortion and fear-enhanced memory, the unusual intelligence to anthropomorphization by frightened witnesses. But the Yupik elders had a different explanation, one rooted in traditional knowledge that predated European contact by thousands of years. They spoke of creatures that existed at the boundaries between worlds, beings that could take animal form but were not truly animals, hunters that had once served as guardians for their people but had been changed by contact with something that came from beyond the edge of the world. According to Elder Mary Kanguk, the creatures that stalked Bethel were Amaroks, legendary wolf spirits that had been corrupted by their exposure to something alien, something that had taught them new hungers and new purposes. The attacks on dogs and livestock weren't random predation but a form of recruitment, an attempt to build an army of creatures that could serve as intermediaries between the human world and whatever intelligence was directing their actions. The circle that Michael Charlie found in the permafrost was still visible 3 years later, despite multiple seasons of freezing and thawing that should have erased any surface disturbance. Hunters who encountered it reported that their dogs refused to approach the area, and that electronic equipment malfunctioned in its vicinity. In 2013, a research team from the University of Alaska attempted to study the site, but their equipment failures were so consistent and comprehensive that they abandoned the project after 3 days. Their final report, heavily redacted before public release, mentioned electromagnetic anomalies of unknown origin and geological formations inconsistent with known tundra geology. The howls haven't returned to Bethel, but residents still lock their doors carefully when darkness falls, still check on their animals more frequently than they once did, still listen to the wind with an attention that wasn't necessary before 2010. Because somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounds their small city, something that learned to imitate wolves is still out there, still waiting, still watching for the right moment to return. And sometimes, on the clearest winter nights when the aurora borealis paints the sky in impossible colors, people swear they can hear an echo of that original howl carried on the wind, a sound that speaks of intelligence and hunger and patience that spans decades. A reminder that the boundaries between the natural and unnatural worlds are far more permeable than civilization likes to believe, and that some things, once awakened, never truly go back to sleep. Story 5, The Abandoned Schoolhouse in Whittier. Whittier, Alaska stands as one of the most isolated communities in North America, accessible only by a single tunnel through the mountains or by boat across Prince William Sound. Nearly the entire population of 200 souls lives in a single building, the Beejich Towers, a 14-story concrete monolith that serves as apartment complex, city hall, and social center all in one. It's a place where isolation isn't just a geographic reality but a way of life, where the line between community and confinement blurs in ways that can drive people to the edge of sanity. But even in a town where everyone lives in the same building, there are places that stand empty, abandoned to the harsh realities of Alaska's economy and the simple truth that not every structure built in the wilderness is meant to last forever. The old Whittier Elementary School is one such place, a 3-story brick building that served the community's children from 1956 until 1994, when budget cuts and declining enrollment forced its closure. The building should have been demolished years ago. It serves no purpose, costs money to maintain even in its abandoned state, and presents a liability that the city council discusses at every meeting but never quite manages to address. But somehow, the old school continues to stand, its windows dark, its hallways empty, its classrooms filled with nothing but shadows and the slowly accumulating dust of 3 decades. And according to the teenagers who dare to explore it, those shadows are not as empty as they appear. The stories began in the summer of 2009, when a group of high school students decided to explore the abandoned building as part of a dare that had become something of a rite of passage for Whittier's youth. The group included 5 kids: Marcus Johnson, whose father worked on the docks, Sarah Chen, the daughter of the town's only dentist, Tommy Beejich, related to the family that owned the apartment building, Lisa Kowalski, whose mother taught at the newer elementary school, and Amy Patterson, a quiet girl who had moved to Whittier the previous year when her father took a job with the railroad. They entered through a broken window on the ground floor, armed with flashlights, cell phones, and the kind of false bravado that teenagers use to mask their fear of the dark. The interior of the school was exactly what they expected: empty hallways lined with open classroom doors, abandoned desks covered in dust, chalkboards still bearing the faded remnants of lessons taught decades earlier. But there were details that didn't quite fit the narrative of simple abandonment. The floors were cleaner than they should have been after 15 years without maintenance. The windows, while dirty, weren't broken or covered with the kind of debris that accumulates in truly abandoned buildings. And most puzzling, some of the classrooms contained evidence of recent activity: chalk dust that looked fresh, books that had been moved from their original positions, even a few instances where messages had been written on chalkboards in handwriting that looked far too neat to have been left by vandals. The teenagers spent about an hour exploring the ground floor, taking pictures with their phones and daring each other to enter the darker corners of the building. It was typical teenage exploration behavior, fueled by adrenaline and the desire to prove their courage to their peers. It was Tommy Beejich who first heard the footsteps. They were exploring the second floor when the sound began, a rhythmic clicking that echoed through the empty hallways with the distinctive cadence of someone walking in hard-soled shoes. The sound was coming from somewhere above them, from the 3rd floor, and it followed a pattern that suggested someone pacing back and forth in one of the upstairs classrooms. The teenagers froze, listening intently to confirm what they were hearing. The footsteps were definitely human, definitely deliberate, and definitely coming from a part of the building they hadn't yet explored. They were also impossible, given that the building had been sealed and abandoned for 15 years. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly through the empty building. "Is someone up there?" The footsteps stopped immediately, as if whoever was making them had heard her call and was now listening, waiting, deciding how to respond. "Maybe it's the janitor," Marcus suggested, though he knew as well as the others that the building hadn't had a janitor since it closed. "Or someone from the city doing an inspection." But Lisa Kowalski, who had lived in Whittier her entire life, shook her head. "Nobody comes here," she said quietly. "My mom's on the city council, and she would have mentioned if anyone was supposed to be in the building." The silence stretched for nearly 5 minutes, and the teenagers were beginning to convince themselves that they had imagined the footsteps when they heard something else, the sound of a locker slamming shut. The metallic bang echoed through the building with the distinctive resonance of a school locker door being closed forcefully. It was followed immediately by another slam, and then another, as if someone were walking down a hallway and closing lockers in sequence. But there were no lockers on the third floor of the Whittier Elementary School. The building had been designed with classroom storage built into the walls, and the only lockers in the entire structure were located in the basement near the old gymnasium. Amy Patterson, who had been quiet throughout the exploration, grabbed Sarah's arm and whispered, "We should leave. Right now." But teenage curiosity proved stronger than teenage caution, and the group decided to investigate the third floor. They climbed the stairs slowly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness ahead of them, their ears straining for any sound that might indicate they weren't alone in the building. The third floor was laid out identically to the second, with a central hallway lined with classroom doors. But unlike the lower floors, several of the classroom doors were closed, and a faint light seemed to be emanating from beneath one of them, a warm yellow glow that suggested electric lighting rather than natural illumination. Tommy Bejic, eager to prove his courage, approached the door with the light underneath and pressed his ear against it. What he heard would change his understanding of reality forever. Inside the classroom, he could hear the sound of children reciting lessons. Not one or two voices, but an entire class of students speaking in unison, their young voices rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of elementary school education. He could hear chalk scratching against a blackboard, the squeak of desk chairs being adjusted, even the whispered conversations that always take place in the back of every classroom despite teachers' best efforts to maintain order. But most disturbing was the voice of the teacher, a woman who spoke with the authority and patience that comes from years of experience managing young children. She was leading the class through what sounded like a geography lesson, asking questions about Alaska's major cities and receiving enthusiastic responses from her invisible students. Tommy motioned for the others to join him, and one by one, they pressed their ears to the door and listened to the impossible lesson taking place inside. The voices were clear, distinct, and absolutely real. These weren't echoes from the past or audio recordings playing on some hidden device. This was a living classroom full of children and their teacher, existing somehow in an abandoned building that had been empty for 15 years. Sarah Chen, whose logical mind rebelled against what she was hearing, grabbed the door handle and tried to turn it. The door was locked, but not with any normal lock. The handle turned freely but the door itself wouldn't budge, as if it were being held shut by tremendous force from the inside. "Excuse me," she called through the door. "We're sorry to bother you, but we didn't know anyone was using this building." The classroom fell silent immediately. No more recitation, no more chalk on the blackboard, no more whispered conversations. The silence was so complete that it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply represent its absence. Then, slowly, they heard footsteps approaching the door from inside the classroom. Soft footsteps, like those of a child, followed by the sound of someone standing directly on the other side of the door. The teenagers could see shadows moving beneath the door, blocking and unblocking the light that had been emanating from the classroom. "Who's out there?" asked a small voice, clearly that of a young child. "Are you here for school? We're having geography class. Would you like to come in and learn about Alaska?" Amy Patterson backed away from the door, her face pale with terror. "That voice," she whispered. "I know that voice." The others looked at her questioningly, but Amy was staring at the door with an expression of recognition and horror that made their blood run cold. "That's Jennifer Walsh," Amy said, her voice barely audible. "She died in 1987. I've seen her picture in the memorial display at the library. She was 7 years old when she fell through the ice on the harbor." The child's voice came through the door again, still sweet and innocent but carrying undertones that no living child's voice should possess. "We're learning about all the places in Alaska where children go when they get lost. Would you like to learn too? The teacher says it's very important to know where you're going when you leave." More voices joined the first, a chorus of children speaking in unison from inside the classroom. "Please come in and learn with us. We've been waiting for new students. We've been waiting for so long. Lisa Kowalski grabbed her friends and pulled them toward the stairway. "We're leaving," she said firmly. "Right now. Don't look back, don't listen to them, and don't stop running until we're out of this building." But as they reached the stairs, they heard the sound of classroom doors opening throughout the third floor. Not just the room they'd been listening to, but every classroom on the floor, doors swinging open in sequence as if an entire school day's worth of classes were being dismissed simultaneously. The hallway behind them filled with the sound of children leaving their classrooms, the familiar chaos of young voices and shuffling feet that accompanies the end of any school day. But when the teenagers looked back, they saw nothing. The hallway remained empty, the open doorways revealing only darkness beyond. They fled down the stairs and out of the building, not stopping until they reached the safety of the Beach Towers and the comfort of electric lights and adult supervision. But the experience had changed them in ways that would become apparent over the following weeks. Tommy Beach began having nightmares about being trapped in endless school hallways, searching for classrooms that moved when he wasn't looking at them. Sarah Chen, the most rational member of the group, started researching the history of children who had died in Whittier, discovering dozens of names and faces that matched the voices they had heard in the abandoned school. But it was Amy Patterson who suffered the most severe consequences of their exploration. Within a week of visiting the school, she began sleepwalking, leaving her family's apartment in the middle of the night and being found hours later standing in front of the abandoned building, staring up at the third-floor windows where soft lights could sometimes be seen moving from room to room. Her parents, concerned for her safety and mental health, scheduled appointments with counselors in Anchorage, but Amy's condition only worsened. She began speaking in her sleep, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there, using voices that didn't sound like her own. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the initial exploration, when Amy's mother woke up to find her daughter's bed empty and the apartment door standing open. A search of the building revealed that Amy wasn't anywhere in the Beach Towers, and a check of the tunnel entrance showed that she hadn't left Whittier entirely. She was found the next morning inside the abandoned school, sitting in one of the third-floor classrooms with a pencil in her hand and a piece of paper covered with neat handwriting that looked nothing like her normal penmanship. The paper contained what appeared to be homework assignments, math problems, and spelling exercises that would have been appropriate for a third-grade student. When police officers led her out of the building, Amy seemed confused and disoriented, with no memory of how she had gotten there or why she had been completing schoolwork that was far below her actual grade level. The classroom where she was found showed signs of recent use, fresh chalk marks on the blackboard, desks that had been arranged in neat rows, even a small pile of graded papers that bore names of children who had died decades earlier. Amy's family left Whittier 2 days later, moving to Anchorage where they hoped distance from the abandoned school might help her recover from whatever trauma she had experienced. The other teenagers involved in the exploration were forbidden by their parents from discussing the incident, and officially, nothing unusual had occurred. But the school continued to show signs of activity. Residents of the Beach Towers reported seeing lights in the building's windows, particularly on the third floor, where entire classrooms would sometimes be illuminated for hours at a time before suddenly going dark. The sounds of children playing could be heard drifting across the town during certain weather conditions, echoes of recess activities that seemed to come from the building's abandoned playground. Most disturbing were the reports from city maintenance workers who were required to check on the building periodically. They described finding evidence that the classrooms were being used regularly, fresh writing on chalkboards, books that had been moved from their original positions, even trash cans that contained recent debris despite the fact that no living person had admitted to entering the building. In 2014, the city council finally voted to demolish the old school, citing safety concerns and the ongoing liability issues presented by the deteriorating structure. But the demolition was delayed when workers reported that their equipment malfunctioned whenever they attempted to begin the process. Bulldozers would start normally but shut down as soon as they approached the building. Wiring systems failed without explanation. Even hand tools seemed to become unreliable when used within a certain radius of the school. The building stands today, still empty, still abandoned, still serving as a monument to the children who once filled its classrooms with laughter and learning. But according to those brave enough to listen carefully on quiet nights, it's not truly empty at all. The lessons continue, taught by teachers who understand that some students never graduate, never move on, never find their way to whatever comes after childhood ends too soon in a place where winter lasts for most of the year and spring is always just a promise on the horizon. Amy Patterson recovered eventually, though she never returned to Whittier and never spoke publicly about her experience in the abandoned school. But sometimes, according to her mother, Amy still talks in her sleep, carrying on conversations with friends whose names don't appear in any current school roster, children who exist now only in memory and in the echoing hallways of a building that refuses to accept that its purpose has ended. Story 6, The Last Call in Barrow. Barrow, Alaska, now officially known as Utqiagvik, sits at the very top of the world, a community of 4,000 souls clinging to existence at the edge of the Arctic Ocean where the sun disappears for 65 days each winter and returns for the same period each summer. It's a place where the concepts of day and night lose their meaning for months at a time, where the boundary between civilization and the endless polar wilderness is marked by nothing more than the glow of electric lights against an indifferent darkness that stretches to the horizon and beyond. In such a place, where the mind struggles to maintain its grip on normal rhythms and routines, the local establishments that serve alcohol become more than just businesses. They become lifelines, gathering places where people can find warmth, companionship, and the illusion that the crushing isolation of the Arctic can be held at bay through shared conversation and the reliable burn of whiskey against the throat. The Polar Inn was one such establishment, a bar that had served Barrow's residents for 30 years, surviving changes in ownership, economic downturns, and the countless small tragedies that accumulate in any community where survival itself is a daily challenge. Located on Agvik Street, just far enough from the main commercial district to avoid casual foot traffic but close enough to be accessible during the worst weather, it was the kind of place where regulars had their own stools and strangers were noticed immediately. Jake Morrison had been tending bar at the Polar Inn for 8 years when the stranger walked in on that February night in 1994. Jake prided himself on knowing every face in Barrow, if not personally then at least by sight, and he had developed the bartender's instinct for reading people, for understanding who needed conversation and who preferred to drink in silence. The stranger was definitely someone Jake had never seen before, which was unusual enough in a town where new faces were rare and memorable. But there were other details about the man that triggered Jake's professional wariness, subtle signs that something about this customer wasn't quite right. He was pale, not with the healthy pallor of someone who simply lived in a place where sunlight was scarce for months at a time, but with the waxy, translucent quality of skin that hadn't seen warmth in far longer than a normal Arctic winter. His clothes were expensive but out of style, the kind of formal wear that might have been fashionable decades earlier but looked strangely anachronistic in a frontier bar where most customers wore practical work clothes and heavy boots. Most unsettling was the cold that seemed to radiate from the stranger's presence. Despite the Polar Inn's efficient heating system, despite the warm press of bodies and conversation that filled the bar on that particular night, the temperature around the stranger's table seemed to drop noticeably. Other customers unconsciously moved away from his vicinity, not because they disliked him but because some primitive instinct warned them that getting too close would be uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. But it was the frost that truly defied explanation. Despite being indoors, in a heated environment, frost clung to the stranger's clothes like morning ice on windows. It accumulated on his jacket sleeves, on the collar of his shirt, even on the surface of the table where he sat. The frost never melted, never showed any sign of being affected by the warmth around it, as if the man existed in his own microclimate of perpetual winter. Jake served him 3 whiskeys over the course of 2 hours, and each time he approached the table, he felt the temperature drop by at least 10 degrees. The stranger was polite, quiet, and tipped well, but he never seemed to actually drink from the glasses Jake brought him. The whiskey simply disappeared, though Jake never saw the man lift the glass to his lips. Other customers that night would later provide similar accounts to police investigators. Mary Chen, a schoolteacher who was celebrating a friend's birthday, remembered the stranger as being perfectly normal except for the cold that followed him around like a personal weather system. Tom Kowalski, a construction worker who had been playing pool near the stranger's table, described the man as friendly enough, but there was something about his eyes that made you feel like he was looking right through you to something behind you that you couldn't see. But it was Louise Bijich, a nurse who worked at the local clinic, who provided the most disturbing detail about the stranger's appearance. Louise had medical training that made her naturally observant about people's physical condition, and she noticed something that bothered her throughout the evening: the stranger never seemed to breathe. Not that he was holding his breath or breathing so shallowly that it wasn't visible, but that his chest showed no movement whatsoever, no rise and fall that would indicate respiratory function. Louise watched him carefully for nearly an hour, thinking at first that she was imagining things, but eventually became convinced that whatever was sitting at the corner table wasn't actually breathing at all. The evening proceeded normally despite the stranger's unsettling presence. The bar's regular customers drank, played pool, and engaged in the kind of conversation that helps people cope with the isolation and challenges of Arctic life. The stranger sat quietly, apparently content to observe the social interactions around him without participating directly. At closing time, Jake began the familiar routine of encouraging customers to settle their tabs and head home. Most of the regulars knew the drill and began preparing to leave as soon as he announced last call, but the stranger remained seated, showing no inclination to move despite Jake's increasingly obvious hints that the evening was ending. "Sorry, sir, but we're closing up," Jake finally said directly to the stranger. "You'll need to finish up and head out." The stranger looked up from his untouched glass of whiskey and smiled. It was a pleasant enough expression, but something about it made Jake step back involuntarily. The smile was too wide, too knowing, as if the stranger understood something about Jake that Jake didn't understand about himself. "Of course," the stranger said, his voice carrying a quality that Jake would later describe as being simultaneously familiar and completely alien. "I was just enjoying the warmth. It's been so cold outside." Jake watched as the stranger stood and walked toward the door, noting that his footsteps made no sound on the bar's wooden floor and that the frost on his clothes never fell off despite his movement. When the stranger reached the door, he turned back and offered another of those unsettling smiles. "Thank you for the hospitality," he said. "I may see you again soon." Then he walked out into the February night, where the temperature was 40 degrees below zero and the wind was strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. Jake finished closing the bar and headed home, but something about the stranger's final comment bothered him. There had been an implication in those words, a suggestion that their interaction wasn't over, that the stranger had some ongoing interest in Jake or the polar and that would bring him back. Jake's discomfort proved to be well-founded. Over the following week, several customers reported seeing the stranger around town, always at night, always in places where he shouldn't have been able to survive the brutal Arctic conditions. Tom Kowalski saw him standing motionless outside the grocery store at 3 in the morning, watching the building with patient intensity. Mary Chen spotted him walking down the middle of the road during a blizzard that had forced everyone else indoors, moving with steady purpose while the wind that was knocking over vehicles didn't seem to affect him at all. Most disturbing was Louise Bijich's encounter with the stranger outside the clinic where she worked. She was leaving after a late shift when she found him standing in the parking lot, positioned so that he had a clear view of the building's entrance. When she approached her car, he turned to look at her with recognition and offered the same unsettling smile that had bothered Jake. "Working late?" the stranger asked, as if they were old friends engaging in casual conversation. Louise, despite her unease, responded politely. "Someone had to cover the night shift. Are you feeling all right? You look like you might be hypothermic." The stranger's smile widened. "I'm perfectly comfortable. The cold doesn't bother me the way it bothers most people." Louise looked more closely at the stranger and realized that he was wearing the same clothes he'd worn in the bar a week earlier, formal wear that provided no protection against temperatures that could kill an exposed person in minutes. Yet he showed no signs of discomfort, no shivering or other physiological responses to the deadly cold. "You should get inside somewhere warm," Louise said, her medical training overriding her personal discomfort. "The temperature's dropping, and you're not dressed for this weather." The stranger shook his head. "I'm exactly where I need to be. But thank you for your concern. You're very kind, just like the others." Louise got into her car and drove away, but as she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw the stranger still standing in the parking lot, motionless and apparently unaffected by the blizzard conditions that were rapidly making the roads impassable. The next morning, Louise found Tom Kowalski's body. He was discovered in his driveway, frozen solid in a position that suggested he had been trying to reach his front door when death overtook him. The official cause was listed as exposure, hypothermia resulting from being caught outside during the severe weather that had struck Barrow the previous night. But there were details about Tom's death that didn't align with typical hypothermia cases. His clothes were undisturbed, showing no signs that he had struggled against the cold or attempted to seek shelter. His face bore an expression of profound peace, as if he had simply decided to lie down in the snow and sleep. Most puzzling, his body was found in a position that placed him facing the sky, his arms arranged neatly at his sides, as if someone had carefully positioned him after death. The investigation into Tom's death was brief and concluded that he had suffered a medical emergency that prevented him from reaching safety during the blizzard. But Louise Begic couldn't shake the feeling that Tom's death was connected to the stranger she had encountered in the parking lot, the man who seemed unaffected by weather that had killed a healthy construction worker. Her suspicions seemed to be confirmed when other witnesses came forward with accounts of seeing the stranger near Tom's house on the night he died. Mrs. Patterson, Tom's elderly neighbor, reported seeing a man standing in Tom's yard around the time the death would have occurred, but she had assumed it was Tom himself and hadn't looked closely enough to identify the figure. Jake Morrison began having dreams about the stranger, vivid nightmares in which the man returned to the Polar Inn night after night, always ordering whiskey, always bringing the cold with him, always watching Jake with those knowing eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something deeper and more vulnerable. In the dreams, Jake would try to refuse service, would attempt to ban the stranger from the bar, but nothing he did would make the man leave. The stranger would simply smile and remind Jake that he had been invited, that the hospitality offered could not be withdrawn, that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Jake started staying late at the bar, reluctant to venture out into the darkness where the stranger might be waiting. He began checking the locks obsessively, peering through the windows before leaving, taking circuitous routes home in an attempt to avoid whatever presence he sensed lurking in the spaces between streetlights. His caution proved insufficient. 3 weeks after Tom Kowalski's death, Jake Morrison was found frozen in his apartment, sitting in his favorite chair with a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him and an expression of complete serenity on his face. The apartment's heating system was functioning normally, the windows were closed and sealed, and there was no indication of how the temperature inside the living space could have dropped low enough to freeze a human being. The investigating officers noted that frost covered every surface in the room, from the walls to the furniture to Jake's body itself, as if winter had somehow moved indoors and taken up permanent residence. The official report listed Jake's death as resulting from a heating system malfunction that went undetected until it was too late. But the heating system showed no signs of failure when examined by city maintenance workers, and none of Jake's neighbors reported any problems with their own heating during the same time period. Louise Begic, now the only surviving witness to the stranger's appearances, began taking precautions that her friends and family considered excessive. She moved to a new apartment, changed her work schedule to avoid being alone after dark, and started carrying religious symbols from multiple traditions, unsure which might prove effective against whatever had killed her friends. But her precautions proved inadequate when the stranger appeared at her new apartment 3 months later. Louise was awakened around 3 in the morning by the sound of someone knocking softly on her door. When she looked through the peephole, she saw the stranger standing in the hallway, still wearing the same formal clothes, still radiating the cold that clung to him like a personal atmosphere. "Louise," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the door despite being barely above a whisper. "I wanted to thank you for your kindness. You showed such concern for my well-being." Louise remained silent, hoping he would assume she wasn't home and leave. "I know you're there," the stranger continued. "I can feel your warmth through the door. You're afraid, aren't you? You don't need to be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you." Louise pressed her back against the far wall of her apartment, as far from the door as she could get. The temperature in the room was dropping rapidly, and frost was beginning to form on the windows and walls. "You've been so worried about me," the stranger said. So concerned that I might be cold, that I might need warmth. I wanted you to know that you were right to be concerned. I am cold, Louise. I've been cold for such a very long time. The frost spreading across Louise's apartment walls began forming patterns, intricate designs that looked almost like writing in a language she didn't recognize. The air itself seemed to be crystallizing, becoming visible as tiny ice particles that danced through the room like snow. But I've found warmth now, the stranger continued. I've found it in the kindness of people like you, people who care about others, people who offer help to strangers. That warmth helps me feel less cold, helps me remember what it was like to be alive. Louise realized that the stranger was no longer speaking from the hallway. His voice was coming from inside her apartment, though she could see no sign of him and the door remained locked and barred. I wanted to share that warmth with Tom, and with Jake, and now with you. It's not something that can be kept by just one person, you understand. It has to be passed along, shared, spread to others who might need it. Louise's breath was now visible in the frigid air, and ice was forming on her skin despite the multiple layers of clothing she wore to bed. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, slowing her heartbeat, making her thoughts sluggish and dreamlike. Don't fight it, the stranger's voice said, now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. It doesn't hurt. It's actually quite peaceful, like falling asleep on a winter night. And when you wake up, you'll understand why the cold is necessary, why some things can only exist in the spaces between warmth and life. Louise was found the next morning by her supervisor, who had become concerned when she didn't show up for work. She was sitting in her living room chair, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures that had somehow invaded her heated apartment, her face wearing the same expression of peaceful acceptance that had marked the deaths of Tom Kowalski and Jake Morrison. The investigation followed the same pattern as the previous cases, concluding that Louise had died from exposure due to heating system failure. But her apartment's heating system, like Jake's, showed no signs of malfunction, and the building's other residents reported no problems with their heat during the same time period. The stranger was never seen again in Barrow, though residents still report occasional encounters with unfamiliar figures who appear during the worst weather, always polite, always asking for warmth, always bringing with them the kind of cold that can freeze a human being from the inside out. The Polar Inn closed 6 months after Jake Morrison's death, not because of any official connection to the strange events but because the new owner found it impossible to keep customers comfortable. No matter how high the heat was turned, the bar remained uncomfortably cold, particularly the corner table where the stranger had sat during his only documented visit. The building stands empty now, another abandoned structure in a town where winter claims everything eventually. But sometimes, according to those brave enough to peer through its windows, lights can be seen moving inside, and the sound of conversation drifts out into the Arctic night, as if somewhere in that cold, empty space, last call is still being served to customers who no longer have any need for warmth. Story 7, The Cabin on the Kenai River. The Kenai River cuts through south-central Alaska like a silver ribbon, carrying glacial melt from the mountains to the sea while supporting one of the state's most famous salmon runs. For generations, the river has drawn hunters, fishermen, and outdoor enthusiasts who seek the kind of wilderness experience that exists nowhere else in North America. Along its banks, scattered cabins serve as base camps for these adventures, most of them simple structures designed to provide shelter and basic amenities in an environment where comfort is measured not in luxury but in survival. The cabin at mile marker 47.3 was built in 1979 by Robert Chen, an Anchorage contractor who wanted a family retreat where he could take his wife and 2 sons hunting and fishing during Alaska's brief summer season. For 15 years, the Chen family used the cabin regularly, creating memories that would last long after the structure itself became something they could no longer bear to visit. The cabin was well built by Alaska standards, a 2-bedroom log structure with a stone fireplace, propane heating, and solar panels that provided enough electricity for basic lighting and a small refrigerator. Robert had positioned it carefully on a slight rise about 200 yards from the river, close enough to have easy access to the water but far enough back to avoid flooding during spring breakup. The location was perfect for its intended purpose. The surrounding forest teemed with wildlife, the river provided excellent fishing opportunities, and the isolation offered the kind of peace that can only be found far from civilization's noise and distraction. For over a decade, the Chen family's annual trips to the cabin were highlights of their year, times when they could disconnect from urban life and reconnect with each other and the natural world. The problems began in 1994, during what should have been a routine week-long hunting trip. Robert and his sons, Michael and David, then 18 and 16 respectively, arrived at the cabin on a Saturday in early October, planning to spend the week hunting for moose and caribou while enjoying what might be their last opportunity to use the cabin together before Michael left for college. The first night passed without incident. They unpacked their gear, checked their equipment, and spent the evening planning their hunting strategy while sharing stories around the fireplace. It was exactly the kind of experience that had made the cabin such an important part of their family tradition. The second night, they heard the footsteps. They began around 11 o'clock, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to circle the cabin with methodical precision. The sound was clearly that of someone walking on two legs, not the four-legged gait of an animal, and the rhythm suggested a person of significant size and weight. Robert grabbed his rifle and flashlight, signaling for his sons to remain inside while he investigated. Alaska's wilderness presented numerous hazards, but human threats were among the most dangerous, and an isolated cabin made an attractive target for anyone with criminal intentions. But when Robert opened the cabin door and shone his flashlight into the surrounding darkness, he found no sign of an intruder. The beam revealed nothing but trees, underbrush, and the familiar landscape he had known for 15 years. Yet even as he watched, the footsteps continued, maintaining their steady circle around the cabin as if the person making them was invisible to both light and sight. Robert called out, identifying himself and warning any potential intruder that the cabin was occupied by armed residents. The footsteps stopped immediately, creating a silence so complete that it seemed to press against the eardrums. Then, after nearly 5 minutes of absolute quiet, the steps resumed, now moving in the opposite direction but maintaining the same deliberate pace. This continued for 3 hours. The footsteps would circle the cabin, sometimes clockwise, sometimes counterclockwise, always maintaining the same distance from the structure, always sounding like the measured pace of someone who had a specific purpose but was in no hurry to complete it. Michael and David, despite their father's instructions to remain inside, took turns looking out the windows in an attempt to catch sight of whoever was walking around their cabin. They never saw anything, even when the footsteps passed directly in front of the windows, even when the sound was so close that the person making it should have been clearly visible. The footsteps finally stopped at 2:17 a.m., ending as abruptly as they had begun and leaving behind a silence that felt almost oppressive after hours of rhythmic pacing. The Chen family spent the remainder of the night taking turns on watch, but they encountered no further disturbances. When morning came, Robert and his sons conducted a thorough examination of the area around the cabin, looking for footprints, disturbed vegetation, or any other sign that someone had spent 3 hours walking in circles around their structure. They found nothing. The ground around the cabin showed no evidence of human passage, no compressed earth or broken twigs that would indicate someone had been walking there. Even areas of soft soil that should have clearly shown footprints remained undisturbed. Despite the strange experience, the Chen family decided to continue their hunting trip. Robert convinced himself and his sons that they had probably heard an animal, perhaps a bear walking on its hind legs, and that their fear and isolation had made them interpret natural sounds as something more sinister than they actually were. The third night proved that interpretation wrong. The footsteps returned, but this time they were accompanied by other sounds that removed any possibility of mistaking them for animal activity. Along with the steady pacing came the sound of knocking, not random impacts but deliberate, rhythmic knocking that moved around the cabin in sync with the footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking around the cabin while systematically knocking on its walls. The knocking followed a pattern, 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 3 more raps. It started at what Robert estimated was the cabin's front corner and moved steadily around the perimeter, maintaining perfect timing with the footsteps. When the circuit was complete, the pattern would begin again, always the same rhythm, always the same intensity. This time, Robert was prepared. He had positioned himself near the front door with his rifle ready, while Michael and David watched from windows that gave them views of the cabin's other sides. When the knocking reached the front wall, Robert threw open the door and stepped outside with his flashlight and weapon ready. He found himself staring at empty air. The knocking continued, now coming from the wall immediately to his right, but there was no one there to make the sound. Robert could hear the impacts clearly, could see the slight vibration in the log walls as something struck them, but whatever was creating the disturbance remained completely invisible. "What the hell do you want?" Robert shouted into the darkness, his voice carrying across the silent forest. "Why don't you show yourself?" The knocking stopped, but only briefly. Then it resumed with increased intensity, the impacts now strong enough to rattle the cabin's windows and make dust fall from the spaces between the logs. The sound of breathing joined the knocking, heavy, labored breathing that seemed to come from just outside the walls, as if someone with serious respiratory problems was exerting tremendous effort to maintain their circuit around the structure. But it was the smell that finally drove the Chen family inside and convinced them to abandon their hunting trip immediately. An odor began to permeate the air around the cabin, a smell that Robert would later describe as resembling advanced decomposition mixed with something chemical, like formaldehyde or embalming fluid. The smell grew stronger as the night progressed, seeping through the cabin's walls and making it difficult to breathe comfortably inside the structure. By morning, the odor was so overwhelming that the family could barely stand to remain in the cabin long enough to pack their belongings. They left that day, cutting their trip short by 4 days and driving back to Anchorage with a story they would never fully share with friends or family. The experience had shaken them in ways that went beyond simple fear, challenging their understanding of what was possible in the rational world they thought they inhabited. Robert put the cabin up for sale 3 months later, but he was honest with potential buyers about the strange experiences they had encountered. Most dismissed his account as the product of wilderness isolation and imagination, but several serious inquiries were withdrawn after prospective purchasers spent a night at the property and encountered similar phenomena. The cabin eventually sold to the Morrison family from Fairbanks, who got it at a significantly reduced price due to its reputation for supernatural activity. Jim Morrison was a skeptical man who prided himself on his rational approach to problem solving, and he was convinced that the previous owners had simply spooked themselves with their own imaginations. Jim's confidence lasted exactly 1 weekend. The Morrison family's first visit to the cabin followed the same pattern that the Chens had experienced. The first night was peaceful, the second night brought the footsteps and knocking, and the third night escalated to levels of disturbance that made it impossible to remain in the structure. But the Morrisons experienced additional phenomena that the Chens hadn't mentioned, either because they hadn't occurred or because Robert had considered them too unbelievable to include in his account. Jim's wife, Sandra, reported seeing faces at the windows, human faces that appeared for just a moment before vanishing when she looked directly at them. Their 12-year-old daughter, Jessica, claimed that someone was talking to her through the walls, a voice that spoke in whispers she could understand even though the words were in a language she didn't recognize. Most disturbing was the incident that convinced the Morrisons to leave immediately rather than wait for their planned departure date. On their second night at the cabin, Jim was awakened by the sound of the front door opening. He could hear footsteps inside the cabin, moving through the main room and into the kitchen, followed by the sound of cupboards being opened and closed. Jim grabbed his pistol and crept toward the main room, expecting to confront a human intruder. Instead, he found the cabin empty but with clear evidence that someone had been there. Canned goods from the kitchen cabinets were arranged on the counter in neat rows, sorted by type and size with an obsessive precision that suggested mental illness or something worse. But when Jim checked the front door, he found it still locked and secured from the inside, with no sign that anyone had entered or left the cabin. The Morrison family left the next morning and never returned. Jim tried to find rational explanations for what they had experienced, but eventually accepted that some phenomena existed beyond the reach of logical analysis. The cabin changed hands 4 more times over the following decade, with each new owner staying progressively shorter periods before deciding to sell. The most recent owners, the Johnson family, lasted less than 6 months before walking away from their investment entirely, leaving the cabin furnished and supplied as if they had simply vanished mid-vacation. Their final statement to the real estate agent handling the sale has become part of the property's unofficial history: "It doesn't want us here." Something in that place has made it clear that we're not welcome, and we're not interested in fighting a war we can't win. The cabin sits empty now, slowly returning to the wilderness that surrounds it. The solar panels still function, the propane system still works, and the structure remains sound despite years of neglect. But no one stays there anymore, and the few hunters who encounter it during wilderness expeditions report the same phenomena that drove away 5 different families: footsteps that circle the building, knocking that follows no natural pattern, and the unmistakable sense that something watches from the forest, waiting with infinite patience for the next group of people foolish enough to believe that human ownership means anything in places where older claims take precedence. The Forest Service has considered condemning the structure and removing it entirely, but somehow the paperwork never gets completed, the funding never gets approved, and the cabin continues to stand as a monument to the truth that some places in Alaska belong to things that have no interest in sharing their territory with the living. Local guides now mark the cabin's location on their maps, not as a potential shelter but as a place to avoid. Because in the wilderness, survival often depends on recognizing when you're not wanted, when you're trespassing on something that has every intention of making you leave, and when the wisest course of action is to pack your gear and find somewhere else to spend the night, somewhere that doesn't come with the promise of footsteps in the darkness and the absolute certainty that you are not alone. Story 8, The Hermit of Kotzebue. Kotzebue perches on the edge of the Arctic Ocean like a forgotten outpost, a town of 3,000 souls where the Chukchi Sea meets the northwestern coast of Alaska and civilization makes its final stand against the polar wilderness. It's a place where the Inupiaq people have lived for centuries, where traditional subsistence hunting still determines the rhythm of daily life, and where the boundary between the known and unknown shifts with the seasons like pack ice driven by invisible currents. 30 miles east of town, deep in the boreal forest that stretches unbroken toward the Brooks Range, there lived a man whom locals knew only as the Hermit. His real name, if he ever had one, was lost to time and the kind of deliberate forgetting that happens when a community decides that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. The Hermit had been living in the wilderness for as long as anyone could remember, at least 20 years by most accounts, possibly much longer. Hunters who worked traplines in the area reported seeing smoke from his cabin during winter months, and occasionally catching glimpses of a tall, gaunt figure moving through the trees with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to live entirely on the land's terms. He was considered harmless, if eccentric, by most Kotzebue residents. The few hunters who had encountered him directly described him as polite but withdrawn, someone who clearly preferred solitude to human company but posed no threat to anyone who respected his desire to be left alone. In a region where self-reliance was prized above almost every other virtue, the Hermit's choice to live completely independent of civilization was seen as admirable, if extreme. But there were details about the Hermit's existence that troubled those who thought about them carefully. His cabin, according to the hunters who had seen it, was always well lit during the darkest months of winter, suggesting either a prodigious supply of fuel or access to resources that should have been impossible for someone living in complete isolation. The smoke from his chimney never seemed to dissipate the way normal wood smoke should, instead rising straight up into the sky regardless of wind conditions, as if it were somehow heavier or more substantial than ordinary combustion byproducts. Most puzzling was the hunting success that seemed to surround the Hermit's territory. Trappers working in his vicinity reported unusually abundant game, as if wildlife was somehow drawn to the area around his cabin. This was the opposite of what should have happened. A human presence, especially one involving hunting and trapping, typically drives animals away from an area rather than attracting them. Elder Joseph Kanguk, who had been hunting the region for 60 years, had his own theory about the Hermit's unusual relationship with local wildlife. Joseph belonged to a generation that still remembered the old stories, the traditional knowledge that explained how the world worked before European contact brought new ways of understanding natural phenomena. According to Joseph, the Hermit wasn't entirely human, or at least hadn't been entirely human for some time. He believed the man had made some kind of bargain with the spirits that controlled the animals, trading something essential about his humanity in exchange for their cooperation and protection. It was an old story, one that Joseph's grandfather had told him about other hermits who lived too long in the wilderness and gradually became something other than what they had been born to be. But it was the events of 1986 that transformed the hermit from a local curiosity into something much more disturbing. Tommy Alexei was checking his trapline on a March morning when he saw the smoke. It wasn't the usual thin stream that rose from the hermit's cabin chimney, but thick, black smoke that billowed up from the forest like a signal fire. Tommy knew immediately that something was wrong. He had seen enough house fires in his 40 years to recognize the difference between controlled burning and destruction. He redirected his snowmobile toward the smoke, following game trails and his own knowledge of the terrain to reach the hermit's cabin as quickly as possible. If the old man was in trouble, Tommy was probably the only person within 50 miles who could provide help, and the winter conditions made it unlikely that anyone else would discover the fire in time to make a difference. What Tommy found when he reached the cabin site would stay with him for the rest of his life. The structure was completely destroyed, burned down to its stone foundation with such thoroughness that very little remained to indicate what the building had originally looked like. The fire had been so intense that even the largest logs had been reduced to ash, and the metal components of the cabin's hardware had melted into twisted shapes that looked more like abstract art than functional objects. But it was what Tommy found in the ruins that truly disturbed him. Scattered throughout the burned wreckage were bones, far too many bones to have belonged to just one person. Tommy had butchered enough game animals in his life to recognize different bone types, and what he was looking at included not just human remains but the skeletal remains of caribou, moose, wolves, bears, and other animals, all mixed together as if they had been stored in a cabin together and consumed by the same fire. The human bones, and there were definitely human bones among the debris, were arranged in patterns that didn't suggest accidental death in a house fire. They were laid out with deliberate precision, positioned in ways that reminded Tommy of the traditional bone arrangements used in certain Inupiaq ceremonies, rituals that had been abandoned generations earlier when Christian missionaries convinced the community that such practices were dangerous and ungodly. Tommy searched the area around the cabin for any sign that the hermit had escaped the fire, but found no footprints leading away from the destruction, no evidence that anyone had fled the burning building. The snow around the cabin site was undisturbed except for animal tracks, and even those seemed strange, as if the local wildlife had gathered to watch the fire burn rather than fleeing from it as animals normally would. Tommy reported his discovery to the Kotzebue police, who dispatched a team to investigate the site. The official report concluded that the hermit had died in an accidental fire, probably caused by a chimney malfunction or improperly tended fireplace. The unusual number of bones was attributed to the hermit's hunting and trapping activities. Clearly, he had been stockpiling meat and other animal parts for winter survival. But the investigators didn't stay long enough to conduct a thorough examination of the site, and they missed several details that would have complicated their neat explanation. They didn't notice that some of the human bones showed evidence of being much older than the fire, suggesting that the hermit had been collecting human remains for years or possibly decades. They didn't document the fact that many of the animal bones belonged to species that weren't native to the region, creatures that shouldn't have been found anywhere within hundreds of miles of Kotzebue. Most significantly, they failed to investigate the reports from local hunters who claimed that the fire had burned for 3 full days, far longer than any normal structure fire should have lasted, and that during those 3 days, the smoke had formed shapes and patterns that looked almost like writing in some unknown language. The official investigation closed after 2 weeks, but the strange events around the hermit's cabin site continued. Within months of the fire, hunters began reporting sightings of a tall figure moving through the forest in the area where the cabin had been. The figure appeared to be human, but there were details about these sightings that troubled even the most pragmatic outdoorsman. The person, if it was a person, seemed to glow with a faint light that was visible even in daylight, and wherever he walked, the local wildlife followed him like domesticated animals responding to their owner's call. Sarah Nick, a teacher who lived in Kotzebue, encountered the figure during a berry-picking expedition in the summer of 1987. She had been working a productive patch about 5 miles from the burned cabin site when she noticed that the forest around her had become unusually quiet, as if all the normal sounds of bird and insect activity had suddenly stopped. When she looked up from her work, she saw him standing about 30 yards away, watching her with an expression of what seemed like mild curiosity. He was tall and thin, as the hermit had been described, but there was something about his appearance that made Sarah's skin crawl. His clothes looked normal enough, typical wilderness gear that any hunter or trapper might wear, but they seemed too clean, too well maintained for someone who lived entirely outdoors. But it was his eyes that truly frightened her. They were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, as if they had been filled with crude oil or some other dark substance. When he moved his head to track her movement, the black eyes reflected no light, seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflecting it back. "Hello," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them despite being barely above a whisper. "You're picking berries. They're very good this year, aren't they?" Sarah wanted to respond politely, but some primitive instinct warned her that engaging in conversation with this figure would be a mistake. Instead, she began backing away slowly, keeping her eyes on him while moving toward where she had left her ATV. "Don't be afraid," he continued, beginning to walk toward her with movements that seemed too fluid, too graceful for normal human locomotion. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just wanted to see what you were doing in my territory." The word territory sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the weather. There was something in the way he said it that suggested ownership, possession, a claim to the land that went far deeper than simple residence. Sarah reached her ATV and started the engine, but before she could drive away, she made the mistake of looking back at the figure. He was no longer where she had last seen him. Instead, he was standing directly beside her vehicle, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him. Up close, she could see that his apparent youth was an illusion. His face had the smooth quality of someone in their 20s or 30s, but his eyes held depths that suggested centuries of experience, knowledge accumulated over periods of time that no normal human lifespan could encompass. "You can come back anytime," he said, his black eyes reflecting no emotion despite the friendly tone of his voice. "I enjoy having visitors. It gets lonely out here, especially during the long winters." Sarah gunned the ATV's engine and raced back toward Kotzebue, not slowing down until she reached the safety of the town's outermost buildings. When she looked back, she could see a thin column of smoke rising from approximately the same location where the hermit's cabin had burned the previous year. Similar encounters continued over the following years, always following the same pattern. Hunters, trappers, or other people working in the area would encounter a tall figure who claimed the forest as his territory, who seemed to exercise some kind of control over local wildlife, and who radiated an aura of wrongness that made rational people flee without looking back. But it was the account from Bobby Chen, no relation to the family that had owned the cabin on the Kenai River, that provided the most disturbing insight into what the hermit had become. Bobby was a game warden who spent much of his time investigating poaching reports and monitoring wildlife populations in remote areas around Kotzebue. In the fall of 1994, he received reports of unusual hunting activity in the area where the hermit's cabin had been, descriptions of someone taking game out of season and using methods that were both illegal and highly effective. Bobby decided to investigate personally, camping in the area for several days to observe any unusual activity. On his third night, he was awakened by the sound of something large moving through the forest nearby, accompanied by what sounded like a herd of animals following behind. Through his binoculars, Bobby watched as a tall figure emerged from the trees leading what appeared to be a procession of local wildlife. Caribou, moose, wolves, and smaller animals followed the figure like trained pets, moving with none of the wariness that wild animals normally display around human beings. The figure led his animal followers to a clearing that Bobby recognized as the site where the hermit's cabin had once stood. There, in the moonlight, Bobby witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he understood about the natural world. The figure began speaking to the animals in what sounded like human language, but language that carried harmonics and inflections that didn't belong in any human throat. The animals responded to his words, arranging themselves in specific patterns around the clearing, as if participating in some kind of ritual that predated human understanding of wildlife behavior. Then the figure began to change. Bobby would later describe the transformation as being like watching a movie played in reverse, as if the laws of physics were being systematically violated in ways that his rational mind refused to accept. The tall, gaunt human form seemed to flow and shift, becoming something larger, something that incorporated elements of the animals that surrounded it while retaining enough human characteristics to remain recognizably the same entity. When the transformation was complete, the figure had become something that Bobby could only describe as a fusion of human and animal characteristics, a creature that combined the intelligence of humanity with the instincts and capabilities of every major predator in the Alaskan wilderness. The creature and its animal followers vanished into the forest before Bobby could decide whether to flee or continue observing, leaving behind only the memory of something that shouldn't have been possible and the absolute certainty that the hermit of Kotzebue had become something far removed from normal human existence. Bobby never filed an official report about what he had witnessed, but he shared his account with Elder Joseph Kanguk, who listened with the kind of serious attention that suggested the story confirmed rather than surprised him. According to Joseph, the hermit had achieved something that traditional Inupiaq knowledge recognized as possible but extremely dangerous, complete integration with the spirit world that controlled local wildlife. But such integration came with a price that few people understood until it was too late to change their minds. The hermit had gained power over animals, extended life, and capabilities that went far beyond normal human limitations. But he had also lost something essential about his humanity, becoming something that existed at the intersection of the human and animal worlds without truly belonging to either. The sightings continue to this day, though they're becoming less frequent as the area around the burned cabin site becomes increasingly avoided by hunters and other outdoor enthusiasts. Those who encounter the figure report that he seems to be growing larger, more animalistic, as if the transformation that Bobby Chin witnessed was part of an ongoing process rather than a single event. Elder Joseph Kanguk died in 2003, taking with him much of the traditional knowledge that might have explained the hermit's transformation or suggested ways to reverse it. But before his death, he left behind one piece of advice for anyone who might encounter the figure in the forest: don't make eye contact, don't accept any invitations, and don't try to help him. He's not lost, and he's not human anymore. He's something else now, something that chose to become what he is and can't be changed back. The forest east of Kotzebue remains beautiful, productive hunting grounds that support abundant wildlife and offer some of the finest outdoor experiences available in Alaska. But experienced hunters know to avoid the area around mile marker 30 on the old mining road, where smoke sometimes rises from a clearing that hasn't contained a building for over 30 years, and where animals behave in ways that suggest they're taking orders from something that understands them far better than any human should. Because some boundaries, once crossed, can never be recrossed, and some prices, once paid, can never be refunded. The hermit of Kotzebue found what he was looking for in the wilderness, but what he found changed him into something that the wilderness itself recognizes as belonging neither to the world of humans nor to the world of animals, but to some third category that exists in the spaces between life and death, between civilization and the wild, between what we know and what we fear to discover. Story 9, The Drowned Town of Chena. The Chena River has carved its path through interior Alaska for thousands of years, carrying glacial melt and seasonal runoff toward its eventual confluence with the Tanana River near Fairbanks. For most of its length, it's a manageable waterway that supports recreation, wildlife, and the small communities that have grown along its banks. But rivers are living things, subject to moods and changes that can transform a familiar landscape into something unrecognizable overnight. In 1967, spring breakup came early and violent to the Chena River Valley. Unusually heavy snowfall during the previous winter, combined with rapid warming temperatures, created flood conditions that overwhelmed the small town of Chena, population 847, in a matter of hours. The water rose with such speed and fury that residents barely had time to evacuate, abandoning homes, businesses, and everything they couldn't carry to the hungry current that transformed their community into an inland sea. By the time the flood waters receded 3 weeks later, the town of Chena had effectively ceased to exist. The river had changed course permanently, carving a new channel directly through what had been the town's main street and leaving the surviving structures partially submerged in backwater pools and oxbow lakes. The damage was so extensive, the cost of rebuilding so prohibitive, that the state declared the town uninhabitable and relocated the survivors to other communities throughout interior Alaska. What remained was a collection of half-drowned buildings rising from shallow water like the bones of some enormous creature, slowly surrendering to decay and the patient work of weather and time. The site became known locally as the Drowned Town, a place where urban explorers and photographers occasionally ventured to document the melancholy beauty of civilization's temporary victory over nature. But according to those who have visited the ruins in recent years, something about the Drowned Town has never quite settled into the peaceful abandonment that characterizes most ghost towns. There are sounds that echo across the water, lights that move through the submerged structures, and phenomena that suggest the town's destruction created something that continues to exist beneath the surface of the new lake. The first documented report of unusual activity at the Drowned Town came from Marcus Johnson, a photographer who specialized in abandoned places throughout Alaska. In the summer of 2013, Marcus received a commission from a magazine that was preparing an article about climate change's impact on small Alaskan communities, and the Drowned Town seemed like a perfect example of how environmental forces could erase human settlements. Marcus planned to spend 3 days at the site, camping on higher ground and using his kayak to access the partially submerged buildings. He brought underwater photography equipment, hoping to capture images of the structures that were completely submerged, adding a unique perspective to his documentation of the site. The first day proceeded exactly as planned. Marcus photographed the visible portions of the town, capturing images of rooftops and upper floors that rose from the water like islands in an archipelago of loss. The buildings were in better condition than he had expected, preserved by the cold water that had protected them from the normal processes of decay that affect abandoned structures. It was during his underwater photography session that Marcus first noticed something unusual about the site. The submerged portions of the buildings were not empty. Through his camera's viewfinder, Marcus could see furniture still arranged in rooms as if their occupants had stepped out temporarily rather than fled a natural disaster. Kitchen tables were set for meals, living room chairs faced television sets that would never broadcast again, and children's toys lay scattered on floors that hadn't seen sunlight in nearly 50 years. But more puzzling were the signs of recent activity. Some of the furniture had been rearranged since the flood, moved into configurations that suggested ongoing use. In one house, Marcus photographed a kitchen where canned goods had been opened and their contents apparently consumed, despite being underwater for decades. In another, he found books arranged on shelves in what appeared to be alphabetical order, a level of organization that suggested someone had been maintaining the library long after the building was flooded. Marcus initially assumed that other explorers had somehow accessed the submerged buildings and rearranged things as pranks or art installations. But as he continued his underwater photography, he encountered evidence that no human diver could have created. In the town's old church, Marcus found the altar area decorated with fresh flowers. Not preserved flowers or artificial arrangements, but fresh wildflowers that looked as if they had been picked that morning and carefully arranged in vases that should have been filled with murky lake water rather than clear water that somehow remained crystal clean despite the surrounding environment. The flowers were species that Marcus recognized as growing in the area, but their condition underwater defied every law of biology he understood. They showed no signs of waterlogging, no wilting or decay that should have occurred within minutes of submersion. Instead, they looked healthier and more vibrant than flowers typically did when growing in normal terrestrial conditions. Marcus photographed the arrangement extensively, then surfaced to check his equipment and review the images on his camera's display screen. The photos showed the flowers clearly, but they also revealed something that Marcus hadn't noticed while underwater: shadowy figures that appeared to be standing in the background of several shots, human-shaped forms that were just transparent enough to suggest they weren't entirely solid but opaque enough to be clearly visible in the photographs. Marcus dove again immediately, hoping to encounter whatever had appeared in his photos. This time, he was prepared for the possibility that the Drowned Town contained more than just abandoned buildings and submerged furniture. What he found exceeded his wildest expectations and challenged his fundamental understanding of life and death. The submerged town was occupied. Not by living people in any conventional sense, but by figures that moved through the underwater streets with purpose and familiarity, going about daily routines that appeared to be identical to those they had followed when the town existed above water. Marcus watched through his camera as ghostly figures walked along submerged sidewalks, entered and exited buildings through doors that opened and closed normally despite being 20 feet underwater, and interacted with each other in ways that suggested an entire community continuing to exist beneath the lake's surface. The figures were translucent but clearly human, dressed in clothing styles that Marcus recognized from the 1960s, the period when the town had been destroyed. They moved with the casual efficiency of people going about familiar tasks, showing no awareness that their environment had fundamentally changed or that they were no longer breathing air. Most remarkable was their apparent ability to manipulate physical objects in the underwater environment. Marcus photographed figures opening doors, moving furniture, and even what appeared to be cooking in kitchens where water should have made such activities impossible. The laws of physics seemed to operate differently in the space these figures occupied, as if they existed in a pocket of reality where the flood had never occurred. Marcus spent hours documenting this impossible community, capturing images that would later be dismissed by experts as elaborate hoaxes or digital manipulations. But Marcus knew what he had seen, and more importantly, he began to understand that the figures were aware of his presence. As he moved through the submerged streets with his camera, the ghostly residents began to notice him. They would turn to watch him pass, sometimes waving in friendly greeting, sometimes following him with expressions of curiosity. It was clear that they could see him as clearly as he could see them, despite the obvious differences in their existential conditions. The interaction that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life occurred in the town's old school building, a two-story structure that had been completely submerged but remained structurally intact. Marcus was photographing a classroom where desks were still arranged in neat rows when he heard something that made him nearly drop his underwater camera. Someone was ringing the school bell. The sound carried clearly through the water, impossible according to everything Marcus knew about acoustics and physics, but undeniably real. The bell rang with the familiar pattern that had once called children to class, a sound that hadn't been heard in the Chena River Valley for nearly 50 years. Marcus swam toward the sound and found himself in the school's main hallway, where ghostly figures of children were moving through the corridor in response to the bell. They were arranged by age and height in the orderly lines that schools had once used to manage student movement, and they were clearly preparing for the start of a school day that had no business beginning 20 feet underwater in a building that had been abandoned for decades. A figure that Marcus assumed was a teacher stood at the front of the line, a middle-aged woman in a dress and cardigan that looked like standard educator attire from the 1960s. When she noticed Marcus observing the scene, she turned to face him directly and smiled with the kind of welcoming expression that teachers reserve for new students. "Are you here to enroll?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the water despite the impossibility of speech under such conditions. "We're always happy to welcome new students to our school." Marcus tried to respond, but realized that his diving equipment made communication impossible. The teacher seemed to understand his difficulty and gestured for him to follow her into one of the classrooms. Inside, Marcus found himself in an environment that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with the physical world he understood. The classroom was dry, filled with breathable air, and comfortably heated despite being completely submerged in lake water. Students sat at their desks working on lessons, the teacher wrote on a blackboard with chalk that shouldn't have existed underwater, and everything proceeded exactly as if this were a normal school day in a building that wasn't 20 feet beneath the surface of a lake. "You can take your diving equipment off now," the teacher said kindly. "You won't need it here. We've learned to make our own environment, independent of whatever changes might occur above us." Marcus realized that he was being offered a choice. He could remove his equipment and join this underwater community, becoming part of whatever existed in the spaces between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Or he could remain an observer, forever separated from full understanding by the barrier of his continued attachment to the physical world. The temptation was stronger than Marcus had expected. The classroom was warm and welcoming, the teacher was kind, and the sense of community that filled the space was unlike anything he had experienced in years of photographing abandoned places. Here was a town that had refused to die, a community that had found a way to continue existing despite the destruction of everything they had known. But something in Marcus rebelled against the invitation. Some primitive survival instinct warned him that accepting the teacher's offer would mean crossing a boundary from which there could be no return, joining a community that existed outside the normal rules of life and death. Marcus indicated that he needed to return to the surface, apologizing as best he could for not being able to stay. The teacher nodded understandingly, but there was disappointment in her expression that made Marcus feel like he was abandoning students who genuinely needed his help. "You're always welcome to come back," she said as Marcus prepared to leave the impossible classroom. "We're not going anywhere, and there's always room for one more in our school." Marcus swam back to the surface, his head spinning with images and experiences that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. He spent the remainder of his planned time at the drowned town on dry land, reviewing his photographs and trying to process what he had encountered beneath the water. The images he had captured were extraordinary, showing clear evidence of the underwater community he had discovered. But when Marcus tried to share his findings with magazines, photography websites, and paranormal investigators, he encountered universal skepticism. The photos were too perfect, the story too incredible, the implications too far-reaching for most people to accept. Marcus eventually stopped trying to convince others of what he had found, but he never stopped thinking about the teacher's invitation. The underwater school haunted his dreams, and he found himself wondering what lessons might be learned in a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where a community had found a way to continue existing despite losing everything they had thought was essential for survival. 5 years later, Marcus returned to the drowned town. His kayak was found floating empty on the lake 3 days after he was reported missing by friends who had expected him to return from his photography expedition. Search teams scoured the area but found no trace of Marcus himself, no diving equipment, no indication of what might have happened to an experienced photographer who knew the dangers of working alone in remote locations. But residents of nearby communities report that on certain clear days, when the light hits the water just right, figures can be seen moving through the submerged streets of the old town. And sometimes, according to those who listen carefully on quiet evenings, the sound of a school bell can be heard drifting across the water, calling students to lessons that have no end, and teachers who have learned that some communities are too strong to be destroyed by anything as simple as a change in the weather. The drowned town remains accessible to adventurous kayakers and urban explorers, but local guides now warn visitors to stay on the surface and avoid any temptation to investigate the underwater structures. Because some invitations, once extended, never expire, and some communities are always looking for new members to join their ranks, regardless of the small matter of whether those new members are still technically among the living. Story 10: The Vanishing Hunters of Ketchikan. Ketchikan clings to the southeastern edge of Alaska like a collection of colorful barnacles attached to the rocky coastline, a town of 8,000 residents where the temperate rainforest meets the Inside Passage and fishing boats share the harbor with cruise ships carrying tourists eager to experience Alaska's rugged beauty from the comfort of climate-controlled observation decks. The city serves as a gateway to some of the most pristine wilderness in North America, thousands of square miles of old-growth forest where Sitka spruce and western hemlock create a canopy so dense that noon can feel like twilight on the forest floor. It's the kind of environment that draws serious hunters, people who understand that success in such terrain requires patience, skill, and the kind of respect for nature that can only be earned through years of experience reading the subtle signs that determine the difference between a successful expedition and a dangerous mistake. In October 2015, 5 such hunters embarked on what should have been a routine black bear hunting trip in the Tongass National Forest, approximately 40 miles northeast of Ketchikan. The group included experienced outdoorsmen who had been hunting together for over a decade, men who knew each other's capabilities and trusted each other's judgment in situations where poor decisions could have fatal consequences. The leader of the group was Robert Morrison, a 45-year-old fishing boat captain who had lived in Ketchikan his entire life and knew the local wilderness as well as anyone. His companions were his brother Michael, a construction foreman from Juneau, David Chen, a pilot who flew supply runs to remote communities throughout southeast Alaska, Tommy Bejic, a hunting guide who specialized in big game expeditions, and Marcus Johnson, a wildlife photographer who combined his artistic pursuits with serious hunting skills. They were scheduled to spend 5 days in an area of the forest that had produced consistent bear sightings throughout the summer, working from a base camp they planned to establish near a creek that provided both fresh water and a natural funnel for animal movement. All 5 men were carrying GPS devices, satellite communicators, and enough supplies to extend their trip if hunting conditions proved favorable. Robert's wife, Linda, received their last communication on October 15, a routine check-in that confirmed they had reached their intended hunting area and established camp without incident. The message, transmitted through a satellite communicator, indicated that they had already located fresh bear sign and were optimistic about their chances for success. When the group failed to return on their scheduled date, October 20th, Linda Morrison contacted the Coast Guard to report them overdue. Search and rescue operations began immediately, using both aircraft and ground teams to cover the area where the hunters had planned to work. What the searchers found 3 days later would become one of the most puzzling missing persons cases in Alaska's history. The hunters' base camp was located exactly where they had indicated it would be, in a clearing beside the creek they had chosen for its strategic advantages. But the condition of the camp raised immediate questions about what had happened to the 5 men. Their gear was arranged with military precision around a central fire pit, as if each item had been carefully positioned according to some predetermined plan. Rifles were lined up in perfect order, barrels cleaned and actions open, ready for inspection. Personal belongings were sorted by type and owner, with clothing folded and stacked in neat piles, toiletries arranged in alphabetical order, and food supplies organized with obsessive attention to detail. But there were no footprints leading away from the camp. The soft soil around the creek should have clearly shown the passage of 5 men, but the ground was undisturbed except for animal tracks that seemed to circle the campsite without actually entering it. More puzzling was the condition of the fire pit. It contained the remains of a fire that had obviously been burning recently, but the ashes were arranged in geometric patterns that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than the random distribution that results from normal wood burning. Someone had taken considerable time to arrange the burned material into symbols that resembled a complex writing system, though no one involved in the search could identify the language or culture that might have produced such markings. The search team's most experienced tracker, a man named Joseph Kanguk who had worked search and rescue operations for 20 years, examined the site extensively but found no evidence to explain how 5 experienced hunters had left their campsite. The absence of tracks was particularly troubling, given that the men would have needed to walk through several hundred yards of soft soil to reach any terrain where their passage might not leave obvious signs. "It's like they just vanished into thin air," Joseph told the search coordinator. "I've never seen anything like it. 5 men don't just disappear without leaving some kind of trail, especially not men who knew what they were doing in the woods." The search expanded to cover over 200 square miles of forest, using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging equipment, ground teams with tracking dogs, and volunteers from the local community who understood the terrain and the challenges it presented. The effort continued for 2 weeks, making it one of the most extensive search operations in the region's history. During the search, teams made several discoveries that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Approximately 2 miles from the base camp, searchers found a tree that bore fresh carvings, symbols that matched the patterns found in the fire pit ashes. The carvings were cut deep into the bark with something extremely sharp, creating marks that were too precise and uniform to have been made with normal hunting knives or survival tools. The symbols themselves defied interpretation. They resembled no known writing system, showed no obvious connection to any Native American cultural traditions in the region, and followed patterns that seemed more mathematical than linguistic. When photographed and sent to experts at the University of Alaska, the symbols were described as unprecedented and possibly non-human in origin. 3 miles from camp, in a different direction, another search team discovered what appeared to be a hunting blind constructed from local materials but built according to architectural principles that made no sense for concealment or weather protection. The structure was perfectly circular, built around a central post that had been carved with the same mysterious symbols found at the camp and on the tree. Inside the circular blind, searchers found more evidence that something unusual had occurred in the forest. The ground was covered with a thick layer of pine needles that had been arranged in complex patterns, creating what looked like a map or diagram of something that none of the searchers could identify. Mixed in with the pine needles were objects that didn't belong in the wilderness, metal fragments that appeared to be precision manufactured but showed no obvious connection to any known technology, and stones that had been shaped and polished to exact geometric specifications despite coming from an area where no such stones occurred naturally. But it was the discovery made by wildlife photographer Sarah Chen, David's sister, that provided the most disturbing insight into what might have happened to the missing hunters. Sarah had joined the search effort both out of concern for her brother and because her knowledge of wildlife behavior might help explain what had attracted the men to this particular area of forest. On the 8th day of the search, while examining a ridge that overlooked the hunters' base camp, Sarah found evidence of human presence that had been missed by the other search teams. Hidden in a grove of ancient Sitka spruce, Sarah discovered what appeared to be an observation post that had been used to watch the hunters' campsite. The position provided a perfect view of the clearing where the men had established their base camp, and it showed clear signs of recent occupation. But the observation post had been constructed using techniques and materials that didn't match anything in Sarah's experience as someone familiar with wilderness survival. The structure was built into the trees themselves, using the living wood in ways that suggested an understanding of forest ecology that went far beyond normal human knowledge. The wood used in the construction appeared to be alive, still growing despite being shaped into architectural forms. Branches had been guided and trained to create walls and supports, creating a shelter that was simultaneously artificial and completely natural, as if someone had convinced the trees themselves to participate in the construction process. Inside the observation post, Sarah found evidence that someone had spent considerable time watching the hunters. There were detailed drawings, carved into wooden surfaces, that showed the 5 men going about their daily routines. The drawings were remarkably accurate, capturing not just the hunters' physical appearances but also their individual mannerisms and the specific gear each man carried. But the drawings also showed events that hadn't been observed by any human witness. They depicted the hunters encountering something in the forest, something that approached their camp during the night and engaged them in what appeared to be complex interactions. The final drawings in the sequence showed the 5 men following whatever they had encountered, walking willingly into the forest with expressions that suggested curiosity rather than fear. Sarah photographed the drawings extensively before reporting her discovery to the search coordinators. When the search team examined the observation post, they found additional evidence that raised more questions than it answered. The wooden surfaces throughout the structure were covered with the same mysterious symbols that had been found at the base camp and carved into trees throughout the search area. But here, the symbols were arranged in what appeared to be narrative sequences, as if someone had been recording events as they unfolded. Dr. Michael Torres, the marine biologist who had been involved in several previous Alaska mysteries, was called in to examine the symbols and provide analysis based on his experience with unusual phenomena. Torres spent 2 days at the observation post, using specialized equipment to document and analyze the markings. His preliminary findings, later classified and removed from public access, suggested that the symbols represented a form of communication that operated according to principles that had no connection to human language systems. The mathematical relationships between different symbol groups suggested intelligence, but intelligence that processed information in ways that were fundamentally different from human thought patterns. Most disturbing was Torres's analysis of the drawings depicting the hunters' final interactions. According to his report, the sequence of images suggested that the 5 men had encountered entities that were capable of complex communication and had somehow convinced the hunters to abandon their camp and follow them into the forest. The search operation was officially concluded after 3 weeks, with no trace of the 5 missing hunters ever being found. The case was classified as a missing persons incident, though investigators privately acknowledged that they had no credible theory to explain how 5 experienced outdoorsmen had vanished without leaving any evidence of their departure. The families of the missing men refused to accept the official conclusion that their loved ones had somehow gotten lost in familiar terrain. They organized private search efforts, hired professional tracking teams, and consulted with experts in wilderness survival and search techniques. Nothing they tried produced any additional evidence or insights into what had happened to the 5 hunters. But strange reports continued to come from the area where the men had vanished. Other hunting parties working in the region reported encounters with figures moving through the forest, human-shaped but somehow wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. The figures were always seen at a distance, always in peripheral vision, and always in groups of 5 that moved with coordinated precision through terrain that should have made such coordination impossible. Tommy Wilson, a hunting guide who worked the same general area, reported an encounter that convinced him to avoid the region entirely. Wilson was tracking a wounded black bear through thick forest when he heard what sounded like human voices coming from ahead of his position. The voices were having what seemed to be a normal conversation about hunting techniques and wildlife behavior, but there was something about the tone and cadence that made Wilson approach cautiously. Through the trees, Wilson saw 5 figures dressed in hunting gear that he recognized as identical to the equipment carried by the missing men. They were examining tracks and discussing hunting strategy in voices that Wilson swore sounded exactly like Robert Morrison and his companions. But when Wilson tried to get closer, hoping to make contact with the men who had been missing for months, the figures seemed to notice his approach and began moving away through the forest with a fluid coordination that was unlike anything Wilson had seen in 30 years of guiding hunters through Alaska wilderness. Wilson followed for nearly an hour, but the figures always stayed just ahead of him, moving through thick undergrowth and difficult terrain without any apparent effort while Wilson struggled to keep them in sight. Eventually, he lost them entirely in an area of dense forest where the canopy blocked most of the available light. When Wilson examined the area where he had last seen the figures, he found no footprints, no broken vegetation, no evidence that anyone had passed through the location. But carved into a nearby tree were fresh symbols that matched the mysterious markings found throughout the search area. Wilson's account, like similar reports from other hunters and outdoor enthusiasts, was never officially investigated. But the pattern of sightings suggested that something was still active in the forest, something that had learned to mimic human appearance and behavior with unsettling accuracy. The area where the 5 men vanished has been quietly removed from hunting guide recommendations, though no official restriction prevents access to the region. Experienced outdoorsmen who work in southeast Alaska have developed an informal understanding that certain parts of the Tongass National Forest are best avoided, particularly areas where the symbols have been found carved into trees. Because some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, and some disappearances suggest possibilities that are more frightening than simple death or getting lost in the wilderness. The 5 hunters of Ketchikan found something in the forest that was capable of communication, capable of persuasion, and capable of making experienced outdoorsmen abandon everything they knew about survival in favor of following voices that promised answers to questions they hadn't known they were asking. And somewhere in the endless green of the Tongass National Forest, 5 figures still moved through the trees, still hunting, still learning, still serving as examples of what happens when human curiosity encounters intelligence that operates according to rules that have nothing to do with the natural world we think we understand.